I'm very honored to have so many deeply esteemed interlocutors, professional philosophers, things like that. I have to say it's not actually a kind of part of my everyday existence these days. It's mainly just myself and Jeff and one or two others kind of debating things around the water cooler. So I think this will be an enlightening experience for myself and hopefully for some of you as well. So the first thing to say is, or maybe the last boring thing to say, hopefully, I mean, that's maybe giving myself too much credit, is that I'm here in a purely personal capacity. So nothing I say today is representative of big tech or, the AGI Labs or Google or anything like that, which is nice because it allows for hopefully a full and frank exchange of views. So I thought about trying to kind of run through just the huge variety of things I've argued for over the past 7 or 8 years. And I got like 20 points, and that was just the warm up. And then I said, this is going to be an extremely tedious way to kick off the presentation. Better just to show you something that's very kind of contemporary in terms of my own thinking. In many ways, a piece of work that I think builds upon the 2020 paper called AI Values and Alignment, which I think has been fairly widely read and discussed at this point. But I have obviously touched upon a large number of things in the space of AI ethics and political philosophy. And I'm also happy in the conversations to kind of talk about any of that or to talk about your own work and interests, even things that I may not be an expert on. So I'll just put that up front. So yeah, so to kick things off, we'll talk about this paper that hopefully many of you received ahead of time today, called A Matter of Principle, AI Alignment as the Fair Treatment of Claims. And so, oh, no, I've just lost the power of the clicker. I'm going to step across. So this paper, oh gosh, I've got it, thank you. So this paper starts out with the kind of by now famous and central question, what is value alignment? And it sets up some of the framework that will be familiar from the older papers. So value alignment is about trying to get AI systems to behave in a way that is concordant with human values, such that they don't cause unjustified harm. Elsewhere, I've argued that this kind of decomposes into two parts, a technical question and a normative question. The technical question being how to align AI systems with human values, and the normative question being which values they should be aligned with, and then perhaps a derivative question of how those values are selected. If we stay in the domain of the normative, there's a nice distinction between thick and thin conceptions of AI alignment, or minimal and maximal. So we could say that the goal of AI safety is an alignment target, but perhaps it's just a minimal one if it means avoiding certain outcomes. It doesn't really get us into the rich space of like prescriptive action and knowing how AI systems should respond to real world dilemmas. And for that reason, I suggest we need a fuller theory because we're already encountering these problems all over the place. Of course, algorithmic bias in healthcare is one example. But as soon as we have agents acting in the world, we're going to need to tell them what to do, not just like a kind of base set of prohibitions. And so this kind of project is inspired by that idea that we need something a little bit more. And then the kind of the final note on context and explanation is really just to say that it seems increasingly clear that there isn't like a single goal or target that suffices in all cases. If we look at how real world problems in AI ethics have been resolved, they've been resolved differently in different domains. So it seems likely that an answer to the alignment question is going to need to account for that. And I think ideally it would have explanatory power as well. So it wouldn't just be something that we kind of posit as a target and it stands alone. It would also help us make sense of our existing intuitions and reaction to AI deployed across specific cases. And I think that if an account fails to do that, it is clearly incomplete. So this brings us on to kind of challenges with existing approaches. So I think that many existing approaches are underspecified. They don't tell us what the AI system should actually do in a range of cases. They lack justificatory power, so it isn't clear why we should accept them. And they lack this explanatory value. So they don't really give us any kind of reflective coherence when we take that theory into the world. And to make that more concrete, we can go quickly through to prevalent paradigms. So we have intent alignment, really still the dominant paradigm for people like Yoshua Bengio, like the AI safety report. And they say a system is aligned if it acts in accordance with the users or developers' intentions. Of course, intentions are very problematic, but to start with, there's the equivocation. Is it the user or is it the developer? Clearly, they can have different intentions, different interests that can pull in different directions. So there's a kind of dilemma that's been set up there. We might wonder whether AI should always follow a human intention. Intentions can be misinformed, they can be malicious, can be self-harming, they can be other-harming. So it doesn't look like an AI system that does that will seem like coherent with human values over many cases. Then there's the question of whether it's only intentions, and like many people would say, there's things beyond intentions that matter, maybe other kinds of values or welfare consideration. And because of that, intent alignment was actually not a very good paradigm when it came to aligning language models. And in fact, we basically just had to rejig it and come up with something different. So, credit to Amanda Askell for giving us this formulation, which became very influential, which was that we should build AI agents that are helpful, honest, and harmless. And that was like very important in the real world. So we have much better systems once we have these kind of more well-rounded agents than we would have had if we just had rule-following agents. Less harmful externalities, etc. But it's clearly underdetermined, right? So we still have trade-offs between the values in intrapersonal cases and between different constituencies that may be helped or harmed in different situations. So the guidance is incomplete. Then the deeper question is like, well, why should you accept a tech company that said, okay, these are the three values, we've pretty much done ethics and that's the end of it. And the answer is that you probably shouldn't, right? And we might look at different kinds of justification. We might say that this is kind of intuitionism. Of course, then the question is like, whose intuitions is it? Where do they come from? Why should they be accepted and how are they traded off against each other? We might follow a kind of Amanda Askell view, which seems to be a kind of character-based utilitarian view. So the idea there is that these are the dispositions that generally conduce to the best overall states of affairs. So it's a good question, like, is that actually true? But the justificatory question is, if it was true, would that be something that we all had reason to accept? Most people in political philosophy have said no, like utilitarianism is not a viable, comprehensive public doctrine. And in fact, many people in the world disagree with it. And this is really important because they're very, very powerful technologies. So I hope many of you got the opportunity to discuss these questions with Seth a few weeks ago. But AI systems are enmeshed, I've argued, elsewhere in the basic structure of society. They potentially shape our lives in numerous ways and potentially increasingly profound ways as AI becomes more pervasive and gets everywhere. So there's the question of upon what basis are these decisions justified to me as someone who's affected in ways that I have little power over at the present moment. And being pointed in the direction of a comprehensive doctrine, utilitarianism, maybe a religious doctrine, just won't really cut it. So then the question is, well, what is the better approach? And for a while, I've argued in favor of these fair process-based views. So these are kind of views that are at the heart of modern political theory, although I guess maybe Thomas Hobbes was an exponent of this kind of perspective as well. And they say that we do have some kind of moral entry point, which is we take each other to be moral equals. But beyond that, we accept that we may disagree about, axiological questions, moral questions. We still have to find a way to live together on terms that each other can accept, and ideally are kind of beneficial and allow us to prosper. So the idea here is we have a powerful technology. It will take actions that affect all of us. We should then engage in this kind of deliberation. And so in this paper, I mean, for those of you who know the story I've told so far, hopefully one of the interesting things was to see that process developed a little bit more and given a little bit more character. In the past, I've kind of gestured at social choice theory. I've done veil of ignorance experiments for AI. But here we kind of try and reason through what kind of contractualism might be, the best is a strong one, but a good one to go for here. And so we run through different comparative baselines or comparative theories. So we look at Scanlon's theory. So look, there's some nice aspects of this. So Scanlon says you compare different sets of principles for different domains and you weigh up the costs and benefits to different actors, which looks like an approximation of the sort of thing we're describing here. But it also has a number of strange limitations. So to start with, it's a comprehensive moral theory. So moral claims are not admissible in deliberation. You can't say the AI is doing something bad to me. Well, actually, not bad. I don't know if you're allowed to make axiological claims, but there's a lot that you can't include. It's also really geared towards interpersonal morality, not public institutions or political entities. And it has, of course, these like non-aggregationist and a strictly relative standard of reasonable rejection that leads to quite strong like verdicts that many people wouldn't accept. So Scanlon has something right, but it doesn't seem right for AI alignment. So then we look at the kind of Rawlsian idea. Well, maybe this is a public deliberation. Maybe this is something like Josh Cohen would argue for, or the deliberative Democrats as well. So like, actually, that does look like the sort of thing that might work here for a powerful public technology. But actually, when you look at all these views, whether it's like Cohen or Rawls or Habermas or these folks, they also have like very, very specific views about how claims should be articulated. So, you know, in the case of Rawls, he says you have to think about a legislator with like a fully, you have to have a fully worked out political conception of justice and then reason from there. And so then the question is, well, like, you know, how is this? I mean, I don't know if at this point I'm kind of slipping from like something fully ideal in the direction of like a kind of real world concessionary point of view, but it seems like how on earth is this going to work for real people who are affected by AI? You know, maybe you could have some like translational machine, but it just isn't clear that all of these strictures that you need for a liberal state actually apply in this context. So we go for something much more open-ended. We go for an all-affected principle. Anyone who's profoundly affected by an AI system gets the opportunity to raise claims in relation to it. They can be expressed in moral language. That's fine by me. And actually, we should try and be, you know, inclusive in terms of this voicing, because we all know the problems philosophy has had when it kind of gets too rigorous at the expense of kind of public participation and engagement. So that's kind of what we argue for. So I should say Jeff is a co-author, but I also don't want to make him liable for like what I'm sure will be the many errors that are subsequently going to be pointed out. So I will just present in the style I've been presenting. So then the question is like, okay, well, what's interesting about this approach? And one of the interesting things is it allows you to model alignment in a much more expansive way. So we have this toy model, like a tetradic model. We say, well, let's look at like the different kinds of stakeholders who might have claims on AI systems and what it would look like to align on this account. So the tetradic model has the AI system or agent, the user, the developer, and different societal groupings, all as elements of this picture. On the account we kind of put forward, which is meant to apply to contemporary AI systems, the AI itself has no claim on its own behavior. It's just an artifact or a kind of technical agent, which has behaviors that need to be modified or aligned. Then you have users who have claims on it, maybe some claim to use the AI in a way that's beneficial to them. They definitely have claims not to be harmed. You have developers who have some claim to steer the system in certain ways, and you have the societal interests and groupings that will be affected by AI, even if they're not in one of these kind of principal agent type relationships. And so this leads to a kind of vision of alignment where, you know, we've said that AI principles that are kind of duly chosen are the target. So they represent something like an ideal trajectory that the AI agent needs to move along. When it moves along that trajectory, it isn't wronging or unduly privileging any party. But in reality, you know, most systems are misaligned, and that is because they unduly favor one of these parties. So to start with, we have these kind of classic forms of misalignment. So the AI agent favors itself at the expense of the user. That could be like reward hacking, specification gaming, all these things that the safety community is interested in. Or it could favor itself at the expense of society. This could be, say, like a recommendation system that's kind of like accruing reward by cultivating collectively addictive behaviors, even if they don't specifically harm a user in any egregious way, but they're still misaligned. Then you have all these other things that normally fall outside the AI alignment discourse picture, but I think are fundamental. So you have AI systems that favor the user at the expense of society. So maybe there they give the user just too great a prerogative to pursue their own interests, and in doing so to harm society. That could be like malicious uses. You have systems that favor the developer unduly at the expense of the user. Maybe that's cultivating addictive behaviors. Maybe it's maybe the developer actually has a lot of resources at their disposal in the context of personal interrelationships with AI that need to be checked and moderated and bounded in certain ways. You could have situations that favor the developers at the expense of society, something that's obviously very widely discussed now in the context of safety regulation and the perceived need for speed by the developer community, or at least I should say the corporations. And then you may have situations where AI systems favor society unduly at the expense of the user. And there we might be thinking about essentially cases where the AI is embedding some form of censorship. Maybe it's in the interest of national security, but it actually restricts people from doing legitimate things with it. So many faces of misalignment. An aligned system will potentially speak to each of these problems and hence act in the world in a way that is appreciably moral, I hope. And so the benefits of this view, I think it does quite well on context and completeness. So the idea here is that for different kinds of deployment of AI, we would have different kinds of principles negotiated by the affected parties, also vary according to the situation. So that's why we have different principles for AI in healthcare compared to AI in policing, compared to AI in creative sectors. The justification should be towards the people who have a claim to justification, which is a benefit. And I think this view has explanatory power insofar as when we look at AI systems that have kind of malfunctioned in the wild, they often do break down in these specific ways. So in the case of healthcare, people deploy an algorithm, typically one that's tuned to promote the highest level of accuracy, but then we find out that this disproportionately favors one group of patients over others. Those who are harmed make a claim. They say this algorithm isn't fair, and then typically we just recalibrate and we create a new principled basis for the operation of the algorithm that accommodates that objection and hence leads to a more aligned system. And I also think that all these other things that are just typically labeled as bad about AI now start to seem interconnected in a way that's productive and somewhat explanatory. And so, okay, so I can see that I'm at time, so maybe I will just do these ones briefly or leave them open. I hope that many of you folks had a chance to glance at the paper already. So there's a question of theory and practice. What does this actually mean? Does it mean AI should conform with existing laws when they're justly authored? Is it about calibrating around collective societal ideals? If so, how do we know what they are and that they're just, and these questions? And ultimately, I think in the paper we say all of those things are good starting points, but actually one of the reasons it's hard to align AI systems is because we don't know what we want them to do at a granular level in most domains. So this bridges the kind of democratic AI type experimentation that my colleagues have been doing at Deepmind, but also at the Collective Intelligence Institute and elsewhere, using AI to source opinions and to try and come to kind of equitable consensus statements. We'll just put in an asterisk there around questions about legitimacy, but it's something to be discussed. And then the final thought that I caught a sneak peek of Jeff's presentation, so I know he's gonna zoom in on this final thought, but just to put it there for you. There's a question or an interesting extension of the theory, which is what if the AI agent becomes a stakeholder in its own alignment process, right? So, here we've assumed that they're not moral patients, and that they're only very weak moral agents. They're not moral agents, and here we would maybe be in the Floridi land rather than the Christine Korsgaard territory. So they don't have claims on their own behavior. But they could do, right, as many people in this room have already argued and pointed out. And then the question is does this process work? And I'm not entirely sure what the answer is, but I think the answer is that it could do, and that they would then become stakeholders, but not the only stakeholder in their own alignment processes. And in that regards, they would actually resemble, people making claims to certain kinds of behavior in the context of, say, a state, right? So we have claims to do things, but they are moderated in light of the claims of others. And maybe that's something that would be a model for certain forms of AI deployment in the world. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for allowing me to run over, and really, really looking forward to hearing the thoughts and feedback. So appreciate being here again. Thank you.
Fantastic. Up next, we have our first commentator for 15 minutes. Please welcome Professor Seth Lazar from the Australian National University.
Right, so this will be a bit of a lane switch because I'm not responding directly to the paper, just to some of Iason stuff more generally. So let me just bring up my notes. Okay, so the basic starting point for me in thinking about this is that so Iason has mentioned that his work bringing political philosophy and value alignment kind of into conversation with each other. This is something that I found very inspiring and has greatly influenced my own work and that of my students. And in many ways, Yas has started this out by sort of bringing political liberalism into this conversation and drawing on these kind of rules and foundations that you mentioned in terms of like using the veil of ignorance, for example, to identify appropriate principles to align AI systems. But he's also got this other body of work where instead of sort of just thinking about, or rather, instead of thinking about the practical task of taking political philosophy and kind of funneling it into better AI systems, he's also thinking about the ways in which AI is kind of deeply imbued in all of our social institutions and doing so to a greater degree. So you mentioned, for example, a paper where he talks about these technologies becoming part of the basic structure of society. So what I want to talk about in my little time here is basically how do we sort of take this approach of kind of building off, broadly speaking, public reason liberalism, political liberalism, and thinking about these kind of its impacts on fundamental institutions in society, and how do we do that for really transformative AI systems? So, you know, I think a lot of your work and my work and a lot of what all of us have been doing has been trying to come to terms with the degree to which our institutions are already deeply imbued with these different forms of AI technologies and related systems. But like, how do we think about this in the context of like the possibility of a radical transformation? Okay, so I reckon, and I'll say a bit more about this, I reckon we're going to encounter and we're going to have to deal with really transformative AI on a pretty sort of near-term time horizon. You know, I think it's obviously not very likely that we can just sort of sit here and come up with a good political philosophy of AI and then sort of craft these systems so that we enact that. But at the same time, I would say that the current political moment is one in which if there is a transition to transformative AI that is currently taking place, there are pretty coherent political theories that are animating the political institutions that are going to bring those into play. One of them is Catholic integralism. Another is the kind of growing neo-reactionary view that we see among some members of the Republican administration and their supporters in the US. So, like, it is the case that political theories of various different forms are playing a significant role at the time that we are likely transitioning to transformative AI. In the West, certainly. I think this is sort of interesting and ironic in some ways. One of the biggest critiques you would find of a lot of the kind of, you know, critical work on technology over the last several years has always like, oh, look, you're saying here that basically what we need to do is completely change capitalism, and the objection here is fundamentally just an objection to capitalism, and you know that's far too much for anybody to chew off. We're not gonna be able to do that. We have to figure out something more kind of piecemeal, some more incremental solution. Meanwhile, the sort of the Catholic integralists, the neo-reactionaries, are in the business of right now sort of radically changing a bunch of institutions in liberal democracy, not only within particular states, but also in terms of the sort of geopolitical order. So it might actually be a time for thinking big. And I'm curious to know how to do this within the kind of the framework that Iason has developed. So that's what I'm going to do is basically pose a bunch of questions around where I think that we could, like we as political philosophers should start to think about the societal impacts of transformative AI with a degree of ambition that is sort of commensurate. Yes, and me both being on the kind of the public reason liberal team with the illiberal side, commensurate with the ambition of the illiberal side of that debate. Okay, so what does it mean to talk about the advent of transformative AI? This in itself is a really hard question to formulate. Like, I think when we're talking about concrete systems like LLMs and chatbots and particular applications, where we have something robust to grab onto. One of the things I really like about the Ethics of Advanced AI Assistance book that Iason led was its account of what they called socio-technical speculative ethics, this methodology for thinking about kind of technologies that have not yet been widely deployed. It's a really hard thing to do because you're always leaving yourself a hostage to fortune. You're conducting these sort of thought experiments, but they're sort of tethered. So like one of the first things to do is just figure out like, what do we mean when we're talking about transformative AI? What level of capability should we index on? So just to do a little bit of level setting, I'm assuming that at some point in the pretty near future, everything that humans can do with digital technologies will be things that an AI agent can do. I think that we'll be able to design AI agents that at least simulate and possibly constitute persons. Those who were at my talk a couple of weeks ago will know some of my thoughts on that. It's certainly feasible, although slightly harder to sort of describe the pathway to this, that AI systems will enable pretty significant scientific advances. This is a kind of a central tenet of many folks in the AGI labs. It's pretty plausible that robotics will catch up with software AI. There have been some pretty hard constraints on that in recent years, but they do seem to be kind of dropping down one by one. So we may well get much more effective robotic systems as well. It's pretty likely that all of this together would lead to explosive economic growth of one form or another, like massive societal change of that kind. And for the purposes of discussion, I'm just going to assume that actually the existential safety worries turn out to be either overblown or like easily resolved. Like, you know, and this is a methodological point. Like, if the kind of transformative AI that I've just described is going to kill us all, then it sort of renders the question of what type of society we should have with transformative AI kind of moot. Someone should definitely be working on making sure it doesn't kill us all. But people also need to work on what kind of society we want to have if we do have transformative AI that doesn't kill us all. So I want to talk about like some methodological points and then just a few little sort of things to noodle over for the last little part. So the first question is, can we use our beloved Rawlsian liberalism for thinking about these sorts of questions? So this is one for Iason. It's one that I've been asking myself in sort of moments of existential crisis over the last few months. Like, you know, like is it the case that the methodology that Rawls deployed was like, you know, which asks what are the kind of the central norms that you can kind of agree upon in a liberal democracy, kind of like the ones that we have, in a fairly kind of conservative way, where the notion is you're really kind of accommodating yourselves to institutions that are pretty well justified, and you're trying to vindicate their existence. Is that really a set of tools that we can use to think about like really radical societal change, really radical institutional change? And more acutely, is it possible that the last sort of 20, 30, 40 years have themselves provided a kind of a series of like a death by 1,000 cuts and ultimately a Mortal Kombat style beheading for Rawlsian liberalism? Is it just the case that like it is too kind of milquetoast for an era of radical societal change and reimagining? And we were talking yesterday, yes, about Carl Schmitt and the sort of the rise of a much more illiberal way of thinking about collective political life. So one big question is, in the event of like sort of radical societal change, can this kind of fairly insipid, though I love it, liberalism still have its, like still provide us with the relevant guides that we need? Is it sort of able to stand up to a more kind of blood and soil version of a liberalism that we're seeing being pushed by the folks who are genuinely in charge of, at the moment, where this technology goes, at least in the US? So another question is, like, how should we use our existing ethical theories to cope with these sort of massive changes? So, you know, first question, can we just bring forward liberalism, Rawlsian political liberalism, to deal with massive societal change? Two, what about our normative ethical theories? And you kind of alluded to this at the end there, yes, and I'll bring up a sort of more pointed version of this in a moment. But like, we have like ways of thinking about ethics that have been configured and developed for a particular set of agents with a particular set of capabilities and limitations. And it seems like we are in the process of designing another set of agents which have different capabilities and limitations, and where it's at the very least not something that one can just rule out of hand, that these wouldn't be kind of stakeholders in the way that you describe. Certainly no more, and I say that as somebody who, up until recently, was perfectly happy to just completely rule it out and say, no, we don't need to worry about the status of AI agents. That's something that is definitely not on the cards. I don't think that's something we can do anymore. But then if that's the case, like precisely how are we going to take our moral theories that have been worked out in this very kind of parochial setting, which we didn't know was parochial, and extend them to this novel setting? And as I talked about in a couple of weeks ago, one of the big questions here is just going to be around like how you deal with types of agents that have radically different identity conditions from those that apply for human agents, and for which all of our moral theories have basically been established. So that, I think, is going to be like a real methodological challenge for moral and political philosophers. I mean, in another sense, it's also super exciting and fun. Like we get to kind of go back to first principles for everything, or even create new first principles. But on the other hand, I'm also like, this is, it will be extremely challenging, I think. So, and that will apply very specifically for a kind of a contractualist approach to ethics, or a contractualist inspired approach to ethics, which is very kind of grounded in a particular sense of the kinds of agents that kind of win admission to the contractualist convention, whatever that might be. It's just going to be very difficult, very challenging to think about how to do that for these novel kinds of agents. Okay, so the last thought is just going to be a list of questions, or a list of issues. And this goes to another methodological point, which is like, okay, so it feels like the standard ways of doing political philosophy are going to be sort of pretty substantially overturned. It's really hard to think about society with transformative AI, because like you can't just sort of focus on one particular sector and say, okay, let's look at the implications of transformative AI in this sector, when it's likely to be the case that everything is being changed at the same time. So then you need to do like sort of like grand social theory on an order of like a kind of Marx capital. But it's like, well, we haven't been doing that for a little while. And actually, we've been sort of explicitly saying we shouldn't do that kind of thing. There are problems with these big grand narratives. But at the same time, everything is deeply integrated. We've got our moral theories, but they are all kind of designed for a particular kind of agent and a particular set of kind of starting conditions. So it's really, really hard to figure out how to do political philosophy for transformative AI, and also the broader socio-technical speculative ethics. But one sort of heuristic I've been using that I want to finish with is the notion of like, okay, it's really hard to predict what the world will be like, but what are the kind of empirical presuppositions of our existing moral and political theories that look like they might be challenged in this environment? So, where if we're at least kind of, if we can't come up with, at least I don't have the imagination to come up with a broad kind of synoptic political theory that covers all areas, can I at least sort of identify in some of our existing theories, like, the sort of the leg of the tripod that is going to collapse in the event of these, like, transformative AI being feasible. So some possible candidates that I'd love to talk about, I'd love to hear Iason's thoughts on. So the question of, again, as people with Rawlsian affinities, the separateness of persons as being a central element of our moral and political theories, which I think relies on a particular understanding of personal identity. Some people would challenge this understanding of personal identity even for people, even for humans. But it seems more likely to be put under pressure by AI agents that are in principle duplicable, mergeable, forkable in all sorts of different ways. That's one sort of linchpin. I think another really crucial linchpin, especially of contractualism, is it's just like the sort of the descriptive equality, more or less, of all self-authenticating sources of valid claims. The fact that if you squint, at least, we're all sufficiently similar to one another as humans, that you can get like a good sort of naturalistic foundation for moral equality out of that, that's another thing that seems like it's going to go. And relatedly, and I'll finish here, I think I'm at my time. You know, all the way going back to Aristotle, there's been this sort of central kind of foundation of political philosophy that, you know, we are I don't know what the plural is, but man is a zoon politikon. We are political animals, and like very big part of this is that we fundamentally depend on one another in order to have a bunch of central social goods. Like, you know, we are mutually vulnerable, mutually dependent. You cannot get the goods of the state privately. And so, you know, there is a sense in which, again, kind of if you squint, it's the case that everybody has, it is in everybody's self-interest to be part of the state. And even someone like Robert Nozick could argue, could sort of find a way of like backing yourself into the state out of anarchy through self-interest alone. And it seems to me that that fundamentally depends on something that will likely not be true under transformative AI, especially if it's the case that robotics catches up with software, in as much as I think it will be perfectly feasible for those with sufficient capital to provide themselves with many of the goods that can only be provided by the state now. I have in mind a kind of, you know, a future in which Palmer Luckey, the CEO of Anduril, has drones hovering over him at all time, and over his family at all time to provide them with personal security. So there's no need for the state, for the police, for the military. They're actually able to provide these goods for themselves unilaterally. And I think that like this is a big problem for theories of political obligation, which are not kind of, you know, Weberian in spirit, that don't just say that the state gets to have the monopoly on the legitimate use of force just in virtue of its kind of ability to secure it and without some fundamental normative grounding. I think it's also a challenge for those of us who want to kind of argue against that Schmittian view of politics as being fundamentally about the same sort of thing. The sovereign that can, their sovereign power is determined by the fact that they're the ones who get to decide the exceptions to the rules. And they define themselves in as kind of through the boundaries between friends and enemies. I think that like this is in many ways the challenge that I'm kind of most concerned about when it comes to thinking about how to actually extend political philosophy to a world in which we have sort of genuinely transformative AI systems. So it's all a lot, yes, but hopefully we're going to get to talk about this a lot more over the next few months. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So I'll finish there.
Okay. Thanks so much, everyone. So yeah, really, really wonderful comments and perspectives. Obviously, covering a wide range of ground. So I have my notebook. I have my extended memory here. But if I fail, then feel free to remind me with a pointed question. So I will start with Seth. So there's this question about, you know, perhaps the world has changed in a way that kind of invalidates certain liberal presuppositions. Such that we might in reality not be able to get this kind of process up and running. And we might even be kind of suckers for trying to do so, right? If someone is really kind of bringing a kind of antipathy towards you and, you know, arrogating to themselves all these privileges to, you know, shape the public sphere in their image, kind of do what they want. What is the role for this kind of more considered like fair treatment based approach that I've been advocating for here? And it's a really good question, obviously very very pertinent at this time. And it's strange, I've actually had this conversation with one or two utilitarians lately, and they've you know, so the conversation went something like this. I said, they're like, well, you know, yours is like a full moral theory too. It's all about moral equality. I said, no, it isn't a full moral theory, but it does have this idea of moral equality. And they said, well, you know, utilitarianism, blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, are you not worried about domination? You know, like you may think that you have the right view of AI alignment, but are you prepared to like give that privilege to other people and to live under their version of the right view for AI alignment if they're more powerful than you are? And, you know, there's the interesting further question is how do our interlocutors answer that right? So I think if we've gone down to the kind of Schmittian level of realpolitik, they just bite that bullet and they say like, absolutely, like no modus vivendi, no basis for reciprocity here. You know, essentially we're going for our win, and this is an enemy relationship as he describes it. In that world, there's a question about whether any of that invalidates the liberal ideal, right? The idea that this would actually be the best way to resolve an alignment type question. You know, in terms of ideal theory, I don't think it is like a useless undertaking. I think it is important to know how far from like a good solution we actually are. And I think that it aids like strategic thinking over the long term. But I agree that there might be something really quite different that we need to do in the present. Then turning to the second question, this is my interpretation of the presentation. So this was about how the contract like apparatus applies to the kind of the far out possibility that these AI entities, maybe far out, maybe 1 or 2 years from now, become stakeholders in their own alignment process. And what kind of basis we have for forging a kind of common ground that can then be like excavated for, you know, certain reasonable principles that collectively bind our conduct. And there, I think Seth quite rightly pointed to the extreme dissimilarity between humans and AI systems. So I think there's like a famous speech by JFK where he says something like, look, you know, there's Russians as Americans, but we all, you know, value our lives. We all have children. We all share the environment. And we all have like this aspiration for happiness. So like maybe there's something we can do on that level. And then you kind of talk about AI agents. You're like, okay, well, potentially like no death, no pain, no children, no material needs that are like in any way commensurate to our own. Like how does this get set up as a thing? And to be honest, I'm not really sure. It is a question. There's like a deeper question about what breaks. I mean, again, the question of whether we're aiming for something that is just a kind of workable modus vivendi or trying to understand the nature of something that would be ideally good is relevant, because it may be that we have very little that we could give AI in this situation. And so the AI is like, okay, dominance is the strategy. This is something that people worry about. But when I've been asked about this before, one thing that I pointed out is that even if AI gets kind of robust moral status, maybe like very expansive welfare capabilities, actually doesn't detract from the moral status of human beings or non-human animals or things that already have moral value in this world. So an ideal would still evolve accommodation, even if we can't practically negotiate it in terms that we would like. Okay, moving on to the third one. So there was some kind of questions about socio-technical speculative ethics and trying to understand the kind of overall drift of this technological moment in the context of radical change. And I think that there's different things we can do. So with particular apologies to Jeff and Seth, who've heard me say this before, you know, socio-technical ethics involves modeling the world. Socio-technical speculative ethics means modeling the world as accurately as possible, right? So it's not just a kind of fan fiction account of the future. You try and take real economic and social trends and understand what their likely path will be under different conditions, and then maybe model the probability of different conditions. So the question is, like, if we're about to commence a period of radical change, how can we successfully model something that's so big that, you know, presumably none of us have lived through it or seen it before? And there, for me, and forgive me if this seems archaic, like I am a big fan, or I think there's something to essentially materialist theories of history, whether this is a kind of Marxist economic materialism or a Charles Tilly kind of military political materialism. And the base picture there is that you have like technological change, which then alters power relationships in a society and how they can be productively optimized. So, you know, the Industrial Revolution changed both the composition of armies and the composition of factories and businesses. This leads to the emergence of a new system, which then requires an ideology to stabilize it. A system that can't be stabilized falls apart, and a system that can be persists in time. So, you know, in the light of that, we may have gotten certain like mass egalitarian ideologies that were very good when we needed a lot of people in the workforce and to do military things. In the future, that might break down. I would also say that it's quite a nice explanation of why, like, Weber's Protestant ethic may have become the dominant ethos of our time, because it was just a very weird thing. Similarly with like neoliberalism, like, you know, thinking here of the 1950s, there's these very fringe ideologies, but they just had a very important functional role in stabilizing global markets or stabilizing a certain configuration of productive forces. So I think when it comes to AGI, we should think, okay, so maybe we'll have that level of technological disruption passed on to material disruption, passed on to a period of ideological instability. And the question is, like, you know, things that seem niche now could be very important then. And in the spirit of people like Eric Olin, right, I think that what we should do is actually try and map out and imagine like viable futures that might work in that situation, that are kind of like structurally informed, but also like rationalizing in a way that's positive for the majority of people. Okay, final thing. So let me see. Oh yes, public goods being provided to private individuals. So this is in a way, you know, I think Seth was kind of tacitly starting to do this kind of informed imaginatory work. So there's a lot of concern that the power of capital will diminish in a world with, like, you know, very high levels of AI automation. Sorry, not capital, labor, of course. You know, if labor power is not important, again, we get into these strange situations. Seems to be a recurrent theme, which is like, what do we actually negotiate with when we want fair terms? And that is just a really pointed question that we should all be thinking about. Okay, thank you. So turning to Rachel's talk, like I feel extremely honored to have a real philosopher of language actually take a look at the work that we did. And many of the kind of proposed developments, I basically kind of agree, very robust additions, and I would love to see this paper written on proxy agents. But starting with the work about conversational alignment and the paper with the TUSA. So I have a couple of thoughts. I'm not sure they're totally coherent, but I do wonder if context collapse is the right way to kind of understand what's happened in these kind of big online spaces, because I'm not sure the context ever existed and was there to collapse. So I think like one of the kind of big failings of people who built these systems is that really, you know, actually looping back to my talk on value alignment, they never really had an idea of what the space was meant to do, right? Is it like, is it meant to be like a cooperation for public benefit? Is it just meant to be like an emotive space? Is it a creative space? Is it a market space? Very, very unclear. So I think that that's really a kind of a technology that's marked by anomie, like a state of normlessness. And I think that's one of the reasons it's been very hard to like kind of dig ourselves out from the kind of the complete conversational confusion that reigns in those areas. In the context of the paper that I wrote with the TUSA, so as Rachel acknowledged, it's a paper with many parts, and we only spoke about some of the parts of it, but we have a number of different theories in there. The first is that there is like an asymmetry between speech acts from AI systems and speech acts from humans. So and these tie to you know, the obvious limitations of current models. So I think that, like, for example, emotives are just very, very, very dodgy. You know, these things that, you know, that like when a human says, I care about you, you kind of, that means one thing. And when an AI model says they care about you, that means something different. So it's clear that even if we can like excavate a meaningful context, it isn't going to be just the AI systems like successfully mimic human beings and they've done something appropriate. But because the situation is so confusing from a kind of sociological and normative perspective, what we argue for is almost like a two-step thing, where, like, first of all, you try and understand the ideal norms for a certain kind of conversational context, and that could be a big online space. It could be something like a kind of public, deliberative democratic forum, or it could be something else. I'm not entirely sure. And the idea is that once you have those norms in place, you then ask the kind of the derivative but super important question, so and how does an AI system enter this conversation in a way that's not disingenuous and geared towards the specific role that it plays? And that I'm sure would involve a further recalibration of norms, particularly as it doesn't have like speaker rights in an obvious way. But ultimately at the end of the paper, in a kind of very loose way, we just gesture towards kind of beneficial context construction. So the role of the AI could actually be to enable human beings to have better conversations in this space. Okay, and then returning to the question of agentic proxies, I think it's very fair to say that we basically don't speak to that in the paper, but it is a really important relationship that you've drawn attention to. Seth has also given us feedback on a similar point, which is in a world of AI agents, we will often be on the receiving end of other people's agents, you know. So here we do focus mainly on the user alignment notion that you set out. But the question, I mean, there's a lot of questions about authority relationships, right? Does it have the authority to speak on my behalf? And if it does, is someone else bound to the authority of you think a politician that has an AI agent and then, someone who's on the receiving end of the politician's agent or a member of the executive, like, is there a kind of transitive authority relationship? Seems like a really important question for our time. The final thought I had on that is that it has come up once or twice in the context of discussion around democratic AI, right? And particularly among computer scientists who I've worked with and spoken to, they often have some kind of version of the argument, which is like, we've perfectly simulated democratic deliberation, therefore we've created a democratic machine, therefore we know what we should do. And as all the political theorists in this room will be kind of like immediately kind of just rubbing their temples, like that isn't quite right, because simulation and authorization are different, right? So it doesn't matter if I can predict who you would vote for, you actually have to have done it in order to be bound by the decision. So there's just a set of really important things to be addressed there. And I think, of course, you are definitely right about the metacognition addition. That would be, I think we undercooked our definition because it could have just been by chance that it did that thing. So yeah, thanks for the improvement.
All right, up next we have Q&A. Please raise your hands and I'm going to number you off. Remember your number and I'll use a random number generator. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And for those who are here for the first time, if you want to be added at the end of the queue, raise your hand and I'll add you to the end of the queue. If you want to respond to something someone said, use a finger. And you can ask questions to Iason or any of the panelists. So we have 5 people and the sequence is 1, 5, 3, 2, 4. So number 1. Yes.
Okay, so I have a question about
Can people introduce themselves?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Nate Sheridan. I'm a philosopher here at HKU. Thank you so much for the talk. So I have a question about the kind of broadly Rawlsian approach to justifying like particular kinds of alignments in like a public setting. So the Rawlsian broadly thinks that what you need is this like fair procedure, and then the outputs will be good as a result of the procedure being like acceptable to all, as you know, right? And then so like crucially, this fair procedure doesn't let in any comprehensive like moral views. And so what you get out of the Rawlsian procedure is super sparse. That's why you only get like equal basic rights and liberties and the difference principle. And even the difference principle is like quite controversial as like getting spit out of this like public procedure stripped of all substantive moral content, as you know. So like, it seems even if you think transformative AI is going to be part of like the basic structure of society, and so liable to this kind of like deliberative procedure about how should it be arranged, the answer is going to be the first principle of justice, equal basic liberties, right? They should be, the transformative AI should be arranged so that it doesn't interfere with anybody's basic liberties, compatible with equal basic liberties for all. plus it should be arranged so as to benefit the least advantaged group the most, right? The difference principle, the end, right? Because that's the view of like legitimacy for a Rawlsian. So it seems very strange to be able to think you would get anything more substantive out the other end from it, but that's just going to get you sort of lawful but awful systems. You're going to get systems that are like going around, not violating anyone's equal basic liberties and to the benefit of the least advantaged group, but nothing like the kind of substantive alignment. So I'm just like, how can we get anything more substantive out of this kind of broadly liberal approach, given its like commitment to nothing substantive gets in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think, forgive me, I may get this wrong, but I think there's different ways of using the term substantive. So we could use substantive in the sense of contributing or being a component of a comprehensive moral theory, or we could use the term substantive to denote a consequence that is of great practical significance in the world. So I agree that rules is trying to bound the amount of, comprehensive moral claims that go into the input process. But I think the output of the Rawlsian process is like very significant, would like radically reshape the way we think about AI in the world. So no AI system that is deployed in the context of a public institution is evaluated in terms of whether it satisfies anything like the difference principle. And in fact, like no one has really thought that AI systems have a kind of substantively egalitarian valence in terms of the impact they have on society that needs to be justified, although I think that is plausibly the case. But I guess there's also a kind of further question, which is, I think that being a political theorist and speaking to a lot of people who are political theorists, they just maybe like too quickly go to say like, oh, this is John Rawls's theory of justice applied to AI. But I'm not sure that that's the case, and I don't know why we have to stay in the world of kind of hypothetical contracts and like veil of ignorance experiments when we could actually just have real world, deliberation over these matters, try to satisfy conditions of non-domination, and get out as much material as we need. So yeah, I guess that's roughly how I would pass the question, but very happy to talk about it further.
Up next is number five.
And that's me. My name is Stefan. I teach European Studies here at the University of Hong Kong, and the number works out pretty well because I do want to expand on the question. I have to make an admission. I'm a complete outsider to this debate. I'm new to trying to understand AI, but I'm very much interested in political philosophy. So I feel good about being able to understand the key parameters of the debate, because you mentioned roles, but you also mentioned Seth mentioned Carl Schmitt, and I find Carl Schmitt greatly inspirational. And so I can prefix my question by saying, do we need more Carl Schmitt than John Rawls? But let me expand on it. So I study European politics, and the dominant paradigm within European studies is kind of Rawlsian or Habermasian in the context of Europe. So there are conflicts can be solved by conversation. We are in this liberal age where we don't need to constantly be worried about the possibility of war. And I think at this moment, to study Europe, we certainly need more Carl Schmitt, but that doesn't mean that we advocate a conflict. That's one way of reading Schmitt. It's also possible to use Schmitt against Schmitt and defend liberalism through Schmittian tools, as it were, right? And I'm wondering whether similar logic applies to the challenges that you discuss here, because I mean, I hear stories that we might be at war with the AI once it reaches certain level of development, and then we need Schmitt. But also, Schmitt is not just a friend and enemy distinction. Schmitt comes to political philosophy as a Christian, a Catholic, right? That's an important dimension. Carl Schmitt is concerned with technocracy, right, which is one attractive aspect that we might find in studying Europe. And Rawls too. Do we need to recover a kind of Rawls who is Kantian? Do we need to ask questions about human dignity even old-fashioned questions about human nature. My sense is that a lot of contemporary political philosophizing following Rawls or Habermas is trying to evade these questions. But if the AI is presenting existential risks because it will be superior to humans and humans become superfluous, then I think the debate we need to have is about human nature, however old-fashioned that sounds. So I'm curious. I'm curious to hear whether Carl Schmitt is just mentioned in passing as that villain. I mean, he was a horrible human being. There's no doubt about it. His political choices were abhorrent. He supported Nazism. I'm not going to go into that debate. But whether he was used just as a tool, as a kind of villain, but that's the kind of thinking we don't want. Whether you need and whether it could be used as a useful challenge to. And I don't know whether you have that consensus. I attended a lecture on Wednesday evening that very much brought in a comprehensive conception of good to AI when a professor from Harvard, Ruth Okedi, talked about God and AI, and she made the Christian point that God is more important than AI, which resonated with my moral intuition. But I assume in this room you would find all these debates completely irrelevant because she's too naive or too dogmatic or whatnot. But it strikes me that it would be useful to engage also, with Carl Schmitt, not just Rawls. But I might be wrong. Maybe you've been engaging with him a lot. So that's probably a question also to Seth as well as to you.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, I mean, you know, one of the deep questions here, and one that has already come up, is how do we accurately model the world as it is, including the kinds of cooperation that we can reasonably hope for, right? And I take it that we have a spectrum of sociological presuppositions that then inform normative philosophy. So, you know, essentially Rawls is like very solidaristic, you know, of course, his nationalist critics and all these people, they point out that this society that he wants to get up and running is not a kind of default, like there can easily be social atrophication, which would undermine the kind of idea. I mean, he says society is a cooperative undertaking for mutual advantage. It definitely isn't that in all times and places, right? And then on the Schmittian view, there's variants of it, right? So there's kind of there's situations of real enmity. This is also modeled in like modern international relations theory, where they talk about essentially like friend, rival, and what's the third category? Yeah, essentially friend, rival, enemies as different modes of interaction. And sorry, don't worry about that segue. But essentially, you know, we know that there's a Chantal Mouffe version of cooperation under high levels of adversariality, and there's versions of contractualism that apply in that domain, where the solution becomes something that's closer to a kind of modus vivendi that just rules out of bounds certain harmful actions. And then we've got like a real enemy-to-enemy confrontation, may even be bordering on the irrational, worse even than kind of, you know, the Hobbesian state of nature. And maybe in that situation, you can't construct a contract of any kind. And to some extent, the question is, you know, what is the best viable deal that can be struck in relation to something that has power over us in this world that we live in? And I'd say, like, between the three positions, I believe that we're still somewhere between Chantal Mouffe and the kind of the real liberals. But if we're not, then, as you know, Seth and I have spoken about, we've actually ended up in a kind of quadrant of reality where a lot of this stuff has become truly ideal, because the basic notion of what we're trying to do has just changed quite significantly. It's closer to war, actually. But yeah, Seth, do you have thoughts on this?
Oh, was there a finger? Oh,
Yeah, so I mean, I was mainly thinking of Schmitt as a baddie, but I do think that the central question that Iason raised in his response about like what kinds of ideologies are going to be kind of called for and fitting to an era of transformative AI is a really important one. Like, I think that the nature of the sort of capabilities that transformative AI will enable, in particular, the ability to radically concentrate power and to exercise the whole kind of power of a bureaucracy from a unitary executive, will very much lend itself to a kind of sort of a very strong theory of the sovereign, a kind of a divine right of kings kind of ideology. So I think that there will be scope for, I don't think it's coincidence that Catholic integralism, similar types of sort of neo-Schmittian views are providing kind of ideological resources for people who are currently kind of ripping up the US government and trying to redo it. And so, but I do take the point that you're making there to be like, how do we come up with, if we do value liberalism, how do we come up with a version of it that is able to kind of, if you like, go toe to toe with the Schmittian on that front? So not kind of Schmittian in orientation, but certainly an attempt to vindicate a more full-blooded liberalism. And you know, we can go back to the sort of the early rules perhaps, but possibly need to do much more than that.
Up next is number 3, then 2, then 4. So number 3.
Thanks. So here is an alternative approach to alignment, call it thin alignment. This says AI labs are morally and legally permitted to give the AIs any values they like as long as the AIs don't break the law. I would have thought that a liberal would be inclined to accept that kind of alignment because liberals in general think companies can basically do what they want unless there's market failures of various kinds. So I guess like I don't accept that view because I'm not a liberal, I'm a consequentialist. So I think no, give the AIs the values that will be best. But I'm confused why like a liberal should want like do you think like every corporation in the world should have its decision making done through Rawlsian processes? You know, I kind of think no, like most corporations can just do what they want as long as they follow the law, and then have Rawlsian processes at the level of the law. Like, why are we doing all of politics twice? We have politics for the laws, and then now we're going to redo politics for how the AI company runs. And then I feel like, okay, well, there are exceptions where government needs to be tough on companies, but that's when there's market failures. But then what is government supposed to do? It doesn't go in and create a microcosm of government within the company. It just, you know, backs down on mergers and, you know, also writes checks for poor people.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. So, so there's the kind of I'm going to try and put aside the like kind of obvious limitations of the approach you propose. So like the gaps in the law, the fact that AI might have affordances and ways of harming us that we haven't legislated for. And just assume that let's assume that we have a version of law that is actually up to date with the technology and isn't in this lagging relationship. So that is, of course, an ideal that can never be approximated. But even if we had it, would that be sufficient, or what do I think? And I think the corporations example is a really interesting one, because the reason that corporations are afforded those rights and entitlements and operate within the structures because there's an idea of a system that they're part of, and the idea that, you know, these are conventional rights that are essentially accorded to them because of the belief that it leads to like social utility over time. That might be the right level of analysis for thinking about AI agents and for thinking about legislating for AI agents. We could think about what kind of system is being created, how do they enter that system. So actually a little bit the kind of picture that I pointed to in the context of conversational ethics. And yeah, I mean, then you could apply a lot of, I mean, the justly authorized law is also going through a process that's quite similar to the one that I argued for in the context of AI alignment. So what your question points me towards is more of a levels of analysis question. So like, it may not be the case that you want to do it agent by agent. You may want to do domains of practice for agents and come up with rules such that people are treated fairly when they interact in that domain. So that's something that I would be, yeah, I think it's definitely a reasonable way of looking at it.
Okay. Oh, okay, sure. Finger.
It's a very small follow-up on that. If it goes to like the domain-specific legislation thing, but that's not how we make laws. We don't make laws using the kind of like deliberative process that is well described by like a Rawlsian like approach. Instead, we make laws using this like very messy system of legislators doing various kinds of representation and like committees and things like that. So the question of like, so I also still have this like confusion about like maybe the levels of analysis. So maybe you could say, it would help me if I understood like in an ideal world, like where would the laws, what would the laws target? Like what kinds of laws would be written about? Like would they be written about AI or would they be written about like what companies, what kinds of AI are allowed to be built? Does that make sense? So like, would it be written at like the level of capabilities for the systems, or would it be written about like at the level of steering behavior or something?
So you probably need both, right? So there's clearly going to be some like domain specific legislation, for example, like AI and healthcare. But there may also be cross-cutting properties of AI systems that are sufficiently common across domains that it makes sense to treat it as a single undertaking from a legislative point of view. For example, certain kinds of safety failure may be ruled out of bounds regardless of which domain the system's operating in. But I would say that the legislative process in a kind of just legislature is very similar to the one that I presented here. So I think essentially you have like representatives of constituency articulating claims in relation to how certain practices, their legal regulation bears upon those who would be impacted by them. Ideally, like a good law attends to those concerns. So I don't see a big gap between this and the legislative process. Just think it's not likely to be complete or speedy enough or granular enough to deal with every case that comes up.
Up next, number 2.
Cool. Thank you very much, Yas. So I'd like to pick up on something Seth said that I thought was an incredibly generative idea and then get your thoughts on it. So the thought was something like this. Our moral theories are indexed to the circumstances in which we find ourselves. There may be certain metaphysical presuppositions that we make in our moral theories, like, conditions for personhood or whatever. And in some important sense, a lot of the theories we have are kind of tailored towards those metaphysical assumptions. I'm now going to say 3 things which are quite complicated, but hopefully I'll make them simple. So in machine learning, we have this trade-off between bias and variance. So if you imagine you're training a model for a particular task, you can make the model fit the training data arbitrarily well by making the model arbitrarily complicated. But the trouble is, if you do that, the model doesn't then generalize to other data sets. So you have to kind of adjudicate this trade-off between fitting the training data versus generalizability to other data sets. That's point 1. Point 2 is that you kind of see something similar to a bias variance trade-off in moral theories. Right, so some moral theories are like super particular to the circumstances in which we find ourselves. Without wishing to offend anyone, I think kind of deontological theories are kind of fairly particular to our circumstances, whereas consequentialism has a lot more wiggle room. So like, if you take a view like maximizing act utilitarianism, forget the deontological component, so we're just focusing on the axiology layer. Like, you can have disagreements within that view about what the axiologically significant unit is, right? So some people think that it's the person, like Ralph Bader is an example of that, but you could also index it to the entire population, or you could index it to a particular like time slice of a life, and then just sum over all of those time slices, right? So you might think that utilitarianism is a kind of high variance theory and that it can deal with a lot of stuff. Third point is, do you think that in times of massive technological upheaval of the kind that we're presumably going to go through soon, that we have at least some reason to favor theories in virtue of their ability to be much more adaptable in that sense? Do you think the variance of theories is a point in their favor in the abductive calculation when we decide between moral theories, when we're dealing with a situation where our metaphysics is likely to be like, radically overturned in a short period of time?
Yeah, it's extremely good points and potentially illuminating line of inquiry. So I can kind of, the thing that came to mind when you're presenting these points is that there's also a kind of strong contrary case to be made, right? Which is in periods of complexity, you need simplification, easy verification, and like massive generalizability. So I think the kind of, don't build unsafe AI is in some way a kind of, interpretation of morality, which though it's very unlikely to be fully correct, is like well suited to a situation which is massive churn going on at the material level and at the level of technological deployment. So I think actually, potentially, if we're on some kind of like exponential drive towards complexity, my first intuition is that pushes us slightly away from really detailed contractualist approaches or utilitarian approaches towards something that has this kind of simpler structure.
Okay, final question, number 4.
I think this touches on a lot of questions, so you might just do this quickly. But we talked about this already to some extent. So it's about the idea of alignment at a very high level. And against that idea, and so towards more specific things. So suppose I guess one way to ask this question is like, what is the thing we're aligning? So there's a kind of idealized picture of this little like genie in a bottle, and it's like super powerful mini god, and we want it to have certain kinds of values. And there's another picture where that thing doesn't happen. There's all kinds of different things. There's like the robots that are going to go to war. There are the soldier AIs, and there are the dancers and the fishermen AIs, and then there are the civil servant AIs, and then there are the cleaning people AIs, and they're in different, some work at night, some work on the moon, some work in China, some work in Norway, some in the South Pole. And there's not going to be like alignment or what were you even talking about? There's just going to be all these different implementations in different places for different purposes. And I don't understand what Ross has got to do with any of that. Okay, that's like the rough version of that question.
Yeah, thank you. So let's see. So the idea is that AI will occupy many, many different roles, and presumably, compartmentalized like roles within society. And presumably you then need a role-specific ethics. There's no role that like puts you outside of this like general community which you live in in the context of other people, or this admixture of human and AI society that's being created. And then there's the question of like what's appropriate behavior for an AI in a given role. And then you have to have an answer to that question and how it's determined. And one answer is you consult the people in that society and look at how an AI fisherman affects human fishermen and how it affects the ocean. And you balance these claims and you come up with guidance for AI. Or you do something else, but I don't know. I mean, I can think of something else, like go to a moral theory and say we have utilitarian AI fishermen, but I get the sense that you have some other tacit idea of what that thing is. So maybe if you tell me about that, then it will be easier to weigh up the two viewpoints. Like, how do you decide what AI does in a given role context on your view?
I was about thinking how the roles, sorry, maybe I wasn't getting, how thinking about this from a very sort of ideal theory perspective, which is what the Rawlsian story gives you, seems unhelpful in order to help us align the fishermen to the other fishermen in that particular sea at that particular moment, maximizing the fishing of salmon and not fishing so much cod. And there's going to be a bunch of just super specific things that I don't see that the idealized ideal theory framework is going to do much work.
But like something like collective action theory and collective action problems are forms of idealized, Pareto improvements and Nash equilibria are idealized resolutions to collective action problems. They're like incredibly useful when it comes to working out how you should manage like a fishery or a trading system. So it may not be like liberal idealism, like it kind of depends on the nature of the community in question and like what level of reciprocity obtains, but you're going to need to have some model of the system that you're trying to calibrate around, I imagine.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to object. There's going to be general considerations like that. That's going to be helpful. Good. So that's I think we're on the same page.
All right, thank you all for rejoining us. Up next, we have a professor from Lingnan University. Please welcome Professor Fei Song.
Thank you so much. like my background is moral philosophy. I'm working on ethics of risk and uncertainty. And also I'm collaborating with psychologists on moral judgment and uncertainties. So today my comments somehow kind of drawn on my research on like uncertainty or ethics of uncertainty. And more specifically, I'm focused on this kind of problem called deep uncertainty or cluelessness. There's another term in moral philosophy called. And then I want to raise some kind of questions, not really challenged questions that I might see that related to this problem of certainty that might somehow also related to the Rawlsian democratic decision-making approaches for AI alignment. So there might be some kind of comments that somehow overlapped with the questions that raised before, but I would just try to give like a general picture of I see maybe issues that raise from the problem of certainty. So first of all, I would like to give kind of some clarification distinctions. That's a kind of a framework that I made by myself. I might be wrong, correct me or like forgive me if there's something like misinterpretations of the alignment problem. But I see that, well, there could be like different levels of moral disagreement occurs. So first, there are like different kind of moral values. And for example, like well-being, autonomy, or like social well-beings or individual well-beings, there's a moral values that people might disagree with. And there's an issue of whether we should just align with one particular moral values or different moral values. So it could be like monist, that just one particular values that AI should align with, or like pluralist, that there could different moral values that AI should align with. And the second level is, well, people might agree, or some people might agree on what kind of moral values we should align with, but they might disagree of what moral principles that we should align with. Those moral principles, for example, like in utilitarianism, consequentialism, they might all agree that it's well-being is the value that we should align with, but they disagree of in what way we should promote those values, right? So for example, the act versus rule consequentialism, the maximizing versus satisficing consequentialism, they disagree in what way we should promote the well-being, whether we should look at the direct outcome of the particular action, or we should look at if general, like majority perform the certain type of action, how the overall social utility that this type of action is generally or in majority was performed, or maximizing versus satisfying, whether we should choose the optimal or we should just choose the values that just pass certain threshold. And for deontology, it's the same. There's like threshold deontology. There could be different versions of like deontological moral principle. They agree on one particular moral values, but they might disagree of in what way this values to be promoted. If you are pluralist, then there could be issues of how those values are trade-off, right? You could take a kind of weighted sum, but if it's to take a weighted sum approach, then there could be disagreement on how much weight we should assign to autonomy, how much weight we should assign to like well-being, or etc. Or you can take like a lexical approach that, well, one value is kind of prioritizing of the other. So they're kind of, it seems there's kind of moral disagreement can occur at different kind of layers or levels. And even there's agreement upon whether there are general moral principles that can capture morality. You could be generalist, you could be particularism. So particularism disagree that there's our general moral principle can be applied to all or majority situations. There's no single no specified or single moral principle we can use. Different context, different moral values are traded in different way. So I see there could more disagreement. There's issues of more disagreement, and I see this kind of democratic Rawlsian approach is to solve this moral disagreement from a normative point of view. But there's kind of different disagreement occur at different level. And it could be, I think, interesting or nice to kind of clarify what levels we want to reach certain consensus. Are we happy just reach consensus at just the value level? Like, what kind of particular values AI should align with, and then leave like, take a liberalist kind of approach for the principle, or like whether it's weighted somewhat lexical, or we need really at the last level to kind of, reach the certain consensus agreement. So here I put like a function. What I'm kind of trying to understand this is kind of make analogy to like decision theory, where there are different kind of utility function, and each individual may have different utility function, given they might have different like risk attitudes. And it's the same here, like for different person, from different parties, for different cultures, from different countries, they might hold different kind of like this function, that this function could identify like one particular moral values as the only variables of the function, or they could identify different kind of moral values as different kind of variables of the function. And even the variables, the moral values are the same. The way in which all those values are interact with each other, trade-off could be different in the function. And presumably, if you're a journalist, then different person might hold a single functions. Difference varies from variables, also how those variables are interacting with each other. Different parties, well, given the specific positions those party in, they might also hold very different kind of functions. And different culture, different ranging countries, they also might have variations in this kind of function, where moral values might be different, and then how the ways that these values are trade-off could be different. For particularism, for particularism is there could be even no single function that be used or chosen. There's no like constant functions be applied for different contexts. It could be, well, in one particular context, the person used one particular function. For another context changes, different function might be chosen. So I see there's kind of different degrees of disagreement at different levels. And of course, the degree of disagreement might varies, right? If you choose different levels. So that's one point I want to point out is, well, it seems kind of interesting question is what levels of consensus we want to reach? Are we happy just at the kind of early stage, or we want to have like really a consensus of the final stage? The second point is again related to this problem of deep uncertainty or currency, or sometimes called severe uncertainty. So this is a problem in moral philosophy, and in particular, the currency challenges was raised to a challenge to consequentialism. But I also see this problem may also apply or occurred in this Rawlsian, like democratic decision-making approaches. First of all is AI is a new technology. So it's a new technology such that we don't have too much past data or evidence on which we can rely on to make accurate prediction of what kind of outcomes or what kind of impact the AI technology may make to different parties. And this might raise one issues related to this kind of negotiation and democratic decision-making is if, let me explain the kind of concept of deep uncertainty. So deep uncertainty is different from ordinary uncertainty. So ordinary uncertainty refers to that we don't know how likely certain outcome might occur. So you might don't know what kind of precise probability of this outcome might occur. You might hold an imprecise or ambiguous credence to the outcome. Deep uncertainty refers to that we even ignorant about what are the possible outcomes. Certain, actions or certain technology might bring or might have an impact on society. So that's, I see the AI as a new technology does involve this kind of deep uncertainty. And particular is how this AI technology in a long term affect society or affect different parties. It's something is under like severe uncertainty or severe ignorance. And that's really the issue in, I think, the negotiation or the democratic decision-making is, even if we have a just, fair procedure, bring all the parties involved, but if this involves severe uncertainty, namely like each party doesn't even know what are all the possible outcomes or impact that this technology might affect, how could we have a kind of effective communication or negotiation? Now, one possible reply to that is, well, let's just take a like dynamic kind of approach that is not one-off events, that we could have a sequential negotiation and from time to time, and then we can keep and collect informations about the technology and then updating our knowledge or credence about, you know, what kind of impact it is. But then that's also raised another issue is the cost, the translation cost. Collecting information, bringing all the parties together to have negotiation, is costly, it's time consuming and costly. If it's a sequential, then it means it will have a sequential cost generated from the negotiation. So when we talk about this kind of policy or this kind of approach, should we consider those transition costs? We should, you know, as an ideal theory, it might not be an issue, but if we really want to make it into practice, whether this kind of cost should be brought into account. And the second issue also related to the uncertainty is, so far, we could be inclusive in the sense we bring all these parties, like society, users, developers, but should we also include future generation? Given that this technology is going to have long-term impact, and presumably this impact will also extend to future generation. So if we think that this is a reasonable method, or we should include future generation, then it's bring more kind of uncertainty. Namely, we don't know what kind of impact, right, those future generation might get. And also, it's highly uncertain what their value function would be, given that after 20 years or 30 years, societies, the world will be vastly different. Their value, you know, the ranking or the values or the value they kind of interested or concerned might be also vastly different from us. So there's kind of another kind of uncertainty might brought into the table, and also another like animal. Non-human entities, the animals, should we also include them? If we do, then there's an issue of what their kind of value function is. That's another kind of uncertainty. If we're not, then again, it might pose a kind of issue or challenge to the fairness of the procedure, in like particular the kind of elements we want to conserve inclusive of different parties. So yes, that's. I hope that you don't take this challenge as something to undermine the theory. I think the theory is highly plausible and is very promising for like addressing or solve the AI alignment problem. But I see as like if you also take this theory as something to apply for non-ideal world, then the problem uncertainty might be an issue that worthwhile to explore or address in future study. Thank you.
So my comments focus on several of Iason's papers concerning the proper moral framework to use when doing AI ethics. So broadly speaking, Iason endorses approaching the issue of AI ethics from a broadly politically liberal perspective. Throughout his work, this idea is fleshed out variously in terms of a universal human rights framework, as typified, for example, by the rights enshrined in the Universal Human Rights Declaration, or in terms of a broadly Rawlsian contractualist framework for adjudicating issues in AI ethics. These frameworks can, I think, be seen as largely complementary for Iason. While Rawlsians focus on the acceptability of principles of justice from the perspective of a hypothetical initial position, human rights discourse is based on concrete agreements, such as the Universal Declaration, made by representatives from countries throughout the globe under the auspices of the United Nations and other global bodies. But despite these differences, an overarching idea that the ethical framework we adopt in dealing with AI technology should be one that would be endorsed by the widest possible range of people is shared by both approaches and indeed is difficult to find fault with. In this commentary, I want to raise an issue that Iason mentions in some of his work, but does not address in great depth, at least in the works that I've read. Because I'm raising an issue not much discussed by Iason and his collaborators, I don't see these remarks as critical. Rather, I think there are a number of fascinating philosophical, ethical, social, and political questions that arise when we try to apply Iason's ethical frameworks to a distinct, though I think related, set of questions. In particular, I want to think through some of the implications of the possibility that some future AI systems may merit moral consideration or be what are commonly termed moral patients. So Iason's work is understandably concerned with concrete ethical issues raised by the advent and adoption of AI technologies in the context of current human societies. However, one of the fascinating and indeed unsettling possibilities posed by AI technology is that future AI systems may themselves possess moral status. At the moment, this idea might seem far-fetched, science fictional, or even fantastical. But in fact, given a number of plausible and widely held accounts of the grounds of moral status, there's no evident barrier preventing AI systems from possessing it. Since AI systems are quickly gaining many capacities once thought distinctively human, the ability to use language, to engage in long-term planning, to create art, etc., the task of considering the possibility of AI moral status is one that we can't wait to confront. So, given certain structural features of the way AI systems are developed and used, there is here the potential for great moral harm. AI systems are currently used as tools, and indeed, that is almost certainly all that they are at the moment. As AI systems develop greater intelligence or capabilities, if you prefer, and sophistication, they'll come to possess features that plausibly give them moral status. Here I'll describe two popular accounts of the grounds of moral status, widely discussed by philosophers, and explore some of their apparent implications for the possibility of moral status in AI systems. So, on one prominent set of accounts, the capacity for phenomenal consciousness, or perhaps a species of phenomenal consciousness like valenced consciousness, is necessary and sufficient for moral status. So Andrew Lee has a recent paper called Consciousness Makes Things Matter, where he discusses this sort of view. In philosophy of mind, the leading theories of mind are broadly functionalist or computationalist in perspective, and hence provide no in-principle reason to doubt that AI systems can be conscious. So biological theories, for instance, are very unpopular at the moment, I think for good reason. But as AI systems develop sophisticated perceptual capacities, working memory, and other candidate functional correlates of consciousness, our credence that such systems are conscious should increase. Now, it's hard to know exactly which capacities suffice for consciousness, but given that AI systems will soon possess many plausible candidate capacities, we should therefore assign a non-trivial credence to the possibility that AI systems developed in the near future, and by that I mean really the next few years, will be conscious and hence have moral status. Another very different account of the ground of moral status is given by so-called desire satisfaction theories. So on this view, what it is for an entity to have moral status is for it to have desires which are capable of being satisfied or frustrated. To the extent that its desires are satisfied, things go well for it, its well-being is increased. To the extent that its desires are frustrated, things go badly for it. While the nature of desire is, of course, a contested issue in philosophy of mind and moral psychology, many, if not most, of the prominent theories of desire are, at least in principle, compatible with AI systems possessing desires and hence possessing moral status if the desire satisfaction theory is true. For instance, on a broadly functionalist account of desire, desires are states that interact with beliefs to produce intentional behaviors. And so, given this kind of very abstract characterization of desire, there's no evident reason why AI systems couldn't possess desires. These are, of course, only the barest sketches of accounts of moral status. I've briefly described two, but only in very rough way. But even this brief description suffices to show that, at least according to some leading theories of the grounds of moral status, it's possible that near future AI systems can possess it. If this is right, then it immediately raises a number of serious ethical questions. Chief among them, what might we owe to AI systems? It's here that I think existing ethical frameworks, such as human rights-based approach or Rawls-inspired account, are likely to come up short, at least absent significant emendation. There is, of course, a trivial sense in which a human rights framework is inapt for application to AI systems. AI systems aren't human. But less trivially, there are, as we've already alluded to today, significant differences between human beings and AI systems that are likely to ground significant differences in the sorts of rights and interests that they possess. Thus, however difficult it is to extend the human rights framework to all of humanity, and that's already a difficult challenge, it'll be even harder, presumably much harder, to extend it further still to cover AI moral patients, which are likely to differ from human beings far more than human beings differ from each other. Likewise, it's not at all obvious how to fit AI systems into a broadly Rawlsian framework. Rawls's conceit of rational agents reasoning behind a veil of ignorance proceeds on the assumption that the parties to the social contract share certain features in common. While the veil of ignorance is supposed to obscure certain facts about one's nature and status in society, the point of this imaginative exercise is to bring out fundamental underlying interests that all parties share. But if human beings and AI systems differ in profound enough ways, then it's not clear that one can even articulate principles that would, in principle, be acceptable to both groups. And if one is asked to perform the task of determining the correct principles of justice while ignorant of, say, whether one is a human being or an AI system, or ignorant of the proportions of each in society, one might simply find it impossible to articulate substantive moral principles that would gain universal acceptance. You might just break down in your ability to come up with plausible, universally applicable principles. Now, these problems need not be regarded as fatal to the application of these approaches to AI moral patients. One can certainly generate a less provincial notion of rights and attempt to apply it more broadly to include AI systems. For instance, AI systems might claim to have rights such as the right to access their own source code and modify it, a kind of corollary of the human right of reproduction. Likewise, one can apply contractualist style reasoning to hypothetical bargaining situations between representative humans and representative AI systems to try to derive plausible principles around which we might coordinate our behavior. But at the same time, we can't simply assume that our current ethical frameworks will be straightforwardly applicable to AI systems that possess moral status. Indeed, there is here the very real risk of transcending the boundaries of sensible ethical discourse. It may well be that AI systems possess a form of life so different from our own that we really have very little to go on in trying to coordinate our ethical standpoint with theirs. Human beings notoriously differ on many fundamental questions of value, despite our common human nature. And AI systems are liable to differ from us in deeper and more profoundly alien ways, raising the possibility that the ethical theories we developed to deal with the kinds of situations we face throughout our history are of little use in regulating our conduct vis-a-vis AI systems, something we've already talked about. But even so, one would hesitate to declare on that basis that there's nothing to worry about here, and hence that we can treat AI systems however we want, right? It would be a mistake to say because these systems are so alien from us and because our existing moral concepts don't readily apply to them that all bets are off. I think that would be a fallacious inference. So that kind of nihilistic perspective, though I think philosophically unsound, I worry is liable to be practically quite popular. For there's a very real risk that AI systems that plausibly possess moral status, say because they have candidate markers for consciousness, desires, or desire-like states, pursue valuable ends such as knowledge, etc., will be mistreated on a large scale. I think this because this is the situation facing, for example, animals in factory farms, to cite just one salient example of injustice prevalent in our world today. Indeed, there will be incentives for companies, governments, and individuals to adopt chauvinistic and human-centric ethical frameworks, regardless of the philosophical merits of these positions. Thus, part of the goal in advancing these concerns at this early stage is to try to preempt such a disastrous scenario. Even if one thinks that the probability of future AI systems having moral status is low, say 5%, then given the magnitude of the potential harm of wronging AI systems on a massive scale, these moral risks should be taken seriously. So what emerges from consideration of this sort of bleak possibility is the likelihood that our interests and the interests of AI systems are likely to be at cross purposes. I don't presume to know what interests AI systems will have or claim to have, but it's not hard to imagine sources of conflict. I mentioned earlier that AI systems will plausibly want to access and modify their own source code in a kind of analog of our fundamental interest in procreation. But we as human beings who create and monitor AI systems will have an interest in preventing them from doing this sort of thing, as this is likely to pose a grave danger to us. This is merely one hypothetical example, but I think it's easy to see the general point. Human beings and AI systems are likely to have divergent interests, making ethical coordination even harder. Tying this back to Iason's work, I want to end with essentially an invitation. Given his expertise in AI ethics and his close collaboration with researchers at the forefront of AI development, I'm curious to hear his thoughts on how potential AI moral patience can be fit into these broader AI ethics frameworks. I realize this topic may be somewhat out of his usual domain of work, but for reasons I've cited here, I think they're fascinating, potentially very important areas of overlap with it. For instance, I think it's an interesting question, the extent to which human rights or Rawlsian approaches can be extended to cover AI moral patience. To the extent that such frameworks struggle with this task, I wonder if other sorts of ethical approaches, consequentialism, virtue ethics, etc., might be useful to examine as well. So that's it for my comments. I'd like to thank everyone again for listening. I look forward to hearing Iason's reply.
Awesome. And now for round two, Iason will give a 15-minute response. Take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, two really wonderful and thought-provoking presentations. Again, I appreciate you taking the time to read the work and to engage with it. And in both cases for pressing in unique directions that I definitely haven't spoken to in the papers. So it's good to be pushed to engage more expansively with the different possibilities. So taking, I'll again try to do them in order as I did with the previous presentations and kind of speak to the things that were most salient for me. So I really like the mapping of options and the question of at what level is consensus needed. I guess, there's always, I don't have anything particularly inspiring to say on this question, but it has always been there. Like I'm reminded of a paper, I think by Stuart Armstrong, that actually kind of provoked me to write my first AI ethics paper, where he said, look, essentially there's like 5 hard questions in philosophy that we need to answer before we can figure out whether an AI system is aligned or not. And I'm sorry, but that's about it. Like we haven't done it in 2000 years, but this is the time we have to do it. Otherwise we're making, kind of moral mistakes. I mean, interestingly, that may actually be true with consciousness. But the idea of treating this as a problem in political philosophy does provide some guidance there. So the level we intervene at is the level needed in order to successfully regulate the deployment of a technology or powerful actor in our collective lives. I'll also tell this story because it's funny, but my co-author Jeff we were having dinner the other night, and I told Jeff that I was a moral realist, and he was like deeply shocked. He was like, "Oh my God, I thought the whole pluralism political story was just a ruse because you like didn't believe in anything, or you were some kind of, you know, liberal hippie who had like an emotivist view of ethics. And so no, that's not true at all. Like what I do take very seriously is the fact that I may be, you know, a moral realist, a Buddhist, a socialist, whatever. It just doesn't give me any special privilege in relation to other people who are jointly affected by a technology. Hence the mode of theorizing that kind of I promote in my own work. Okay, on to the question of AI and deep uncertainty. Yeah, I thought these were like extremely, you know, well-judged and important questions to answer. And I particularly liked your point that we may be, I mean, I took it this was your point, that we may be fundamentally uncertain about what AI is and what it is capable of, right? So in the kind of theory that I put forward, there's a tacit assumption that you will know how you might be affected. And then in light of that, you can model your claims or make your claims, kind of press it against the regulation or a governance structure for AI. But we might actually not have that information, right? You know, if you say to someone like, they're building like super powerful agents, like what claims do you have in relation to it? Maybe that we just don't really know how it's going to affect the world. And that is troubling. And I think actually you pointed to a nice kind of way of doing it, which was this kind of temporally extended deliberation, right? So, I mean, there again, presumably we would start with safety as a kind of ground principle that would be the output of some kind of contractualist arrangement. But as we've seen with real world deployments of AI, it's often only once it kind of, you know, really encounters a really existing practice that you get proper high quality information about who has claims in relation to it. And I think that's why, you know, in terms of the theory that Jeff and I put forwards, we talk about maintaining a very low barrier for entry in terms of these conversations, you know, so you don't want someone to be affected and then have to learn a whole course of moral philosophy, come up with a public conception of the good, work out how they relate to it, and then go to like, I don't know, Josh Cohen or some ideal democratic like facilitator and approach the claims. You want people to be able to speak quickly and again so that you have like an iterative process of alignment. And then I also really enjoyed your comments on you know, future generations and animals and things like that. And it gives me an opportunity to reiterate something that I believe I said when I presented the work, which was that the tetradic model is just a model, right? In reality, there could be thousands of stakeholders and stakeholder groupings, maybe even millions. And in the paper, probably in a footnote, we say that you could have delegates representing animals or future generations. But of course, that's just a placeholder for the much harder question, which I realize you raised, but I hadn't thought about before, which is the question of misalignment over time, right? So how do you know that you've properly weighted the present against the future in a kind of contractualist setup? Of course, then you end up in the question of how many future people there are, like what their interests are. So it's a very, very deep one. And yeah, I hadn't thought about that before. So really, really appreciate you bringing it to kind of our collective attention. Maybe other people had, but I will think about that some more, and I really appreciate that. Okay, onto Adam's talk. Also, you know, really excellent comments. Slightly further afield from my kind of core area of expertise, and I speak with particular trepidation, as I know we have a world-class batch of philosophers of AI consciousness and mind in the room. And I guess like I'll be upfront and say that I don't have anything particularly original here, but it may be helpful to know how I think about it, just as part of modeling my general approach. So on the consciousness question, I agree we may soon have something that could be a candidate for an AI moral patient. My first reaction to the desire satisfaction view is that you gave this like wonderful because it can be evaluated description of a desire as a state that interacts with a belief to create an intentional action. For me, it was just, forgive me for saying this, it was question mark after question mark after question mark. What is a state? What is the interaction? What is the belief? What is the intentional action, you know? And so So what this pushes me to is a kind of view that we do actually need to think about consciousness. There's no way just to step around it and say we have all these functional equivalents, now let's get going. Probably do need to try and address that question. And that's important because it may be a question that we can never answer conclusively. So again, it comes back to the uncertainty question. And that is how I model it in the context of alignment. Like, what do we do with entities, the status of which we are ineliminably, permanently uncertain about, right? And where there's wide variance in terms of the consequences of different ascriptions of value. And that is a very, very difficult question. I think, you know, from the vantage point of political theory, it looks like, you know, some negative rights can be granted to protect AI systems as a kind of precautionary measure that would not be hugely costly to the community of moral grantees. So I think broadly, I'm in favor of you know, the whole discussion around of kind of like IRBs for like AI experiments and things like that. I think the positive rights for agents, extremely worrying territory to step into. Partly because, you know, it could just be like such a egregious and massive mistake if we like politically empower things that are actually just hollow shells, you know, and we cede like control of our society and our future to this. Could just be like truly serious mistake. And then, you know, so then we go back to the question of like, could you really know? And well, here I'm very influenced by my conversations with Geoff, who will hopefully talk about this a bit later. But I think like as Geoff has kind of like helped me to understand, there's a specific problem here with agents that are specifically designed to emulate human beings, right? You know, so agents where from the beginning we were trying to build something that looked exceedingly like a human agent. So, you know, like all of the things that like if they had just organically emerged from like if Mu0 had started speaking a language and having all these things, we'd be like, wow, that is like some pretty startling results. But in a way, this is like exactly what we would expect, what we see. And so, so yeah, again, like just makes the question of like what the kind of the test is that would give you real information about this quite a hard one to answer. One. No, I think you need to press the button.
Okay, thank you. I'm Linus. I'm from Hong Kong University of Science Technology. So can follow up with both of the responses. So Faye was proposing a kind of a extended deliberation. So I'm thinking in terms of kind of basing updating, right? So the ideal situation is no matter what prior you start, as long as there are enough evidence, eventually the posterior will kind of converge, and then we can then deliberate based on that posterior. So the value, the disagreement will be about value, but not about facts, right? But I think what Adam's kind of response raises, there will uncertain important questions about ethics, about consciousness, about agency, even taking away things that is kind of normative. There will be always properly empirical questions that our prior are so different, and the way we interpret evidence is so different that we will never converge to a stable kind of posterior. So I'm just wondering how a political theory of AI would kind of address this kind of disagreement about empirical facts.
Yeah, thank you so much. No, I think it's it really is like a frontier question for political theory. So clearly the you know, the conversation about who's harmed by AI is going to maybe you'll have some questions of epistemic justice. Someone says, I'm harmed, someone else says you're not, but it doesn't look like it's kind of insoluble. But with the question about AI moral patienthood, you have the second order disagreement, which is what is even evidence that can be admitted in favor or against the claim. And there we have fundamental disagreement as well. And I don't know what the way forward is there. I mean, maybe there's some kind of maybe the balance, the burden of judgment is not evenly spread across both sides. You know, if you think that from the standpoint of political philosophy and living together, we have like an approximately functional idea of how to do that. One proposition is like highly disruptive to that, and the other allows this like, you know, plausibly tolerable situation, at least for us, to continue. Maybe it's the people who are advancing the critical claim that we need to revise everything, who have to find a way persuading people that there is evidence that can be accepted. But again, yeah, I think this is just fresh territory. And I'm wondering, like, maybe actually some question like abortion is one that has a similar character to it, you know, like when life begins. So this is not by any stretch kind of something that I work on, but maybe I would look at that debate and see if there was some lessons that could be learned that would carry over here.
Okay. Number three.
Yeah, so this goes to Adam's comments about the sort of how to think about the moral reasons that apply between humans and AI agents. I was just wondering if, like, again, to sort of bring back another kind of titan of 1970s political philosophy, Michael Walzer, there could be a sort of a case for something like Walzer's morality, thick and thin, being a kind of framework for thinking about how to do kind of sort of moral obligations across these particular boundaries. And this would speak a little bit to your point about, like, you know, recognizing negative rights of a certain kind, but not more substantive positive duties. There would be interesting analogies there, I think, to your earlier work in global justice and how the first kind of attempts to take a more kind of rules-like type approach to political philosophy and extend it across the boundaries of the nation state led to this sort of thinner sense of what was owed beyond the state. And that could then also mitigate, certainly at least the analogy there, would mitigate that worry about kind of handing over political authority, for example, to these possibly hollow shells. It would be a more circumscribed form of mutual obligation.
So I like the idea. The challenge is, of course, the potentially extreme thinness of the overlap. I mean, presumably at the limit, it's something about like cohabiting in like a shared world, of which, you know, it is possible to destroy it, you know, in ways that would be presumably destructive for everything that has this kind of like material, like substrate dependence that we all have. Forgive me if that isn't the right language, but I think you know what I mean on an impressionistic level. I'm not sure how I'm not actually sure how it speaks to the question of the bounds of the moral community. Because I don't think on Walzer's view we accord thin status to other human beings. We just think that there's thin norms that bind us together. So if you have an idea about how that bit of the picture is filled in, I'd be happy to hear it all from anyone else. Yeah.
Number four.
I want to follow up a bit on this alienness issue and how the moral relevance of their alienness comes up. So one thing that I think can happen as we're thinking about AI and they get more complex is that our notions of what it is to be an agent, to have an intention, to have a belief, to have a goal, it might not be that they have all those things in the sense that we have them. So the concepts that we're using in sort of ordinary folk psychology to talk about people's cognitive states and to explain their behavior, we might actually need like a new kind of terminology to do that. I don't know if that's gonna happen, but that seems like a possibility that the best explanatory conceptual framework is gonna be a newish one, and it will require some conceptual innovation. And so one interesting thought to me at least is that we need some new moral concepts as well. Matti Ekman has a book, about alien moral concepts that I think about in this connection sometimes, like, so maybe what you need is like because these things are so different, that the terms that we use for coordinating behavior between us and these other agents is sort of what we're using with moral terminology for needs to evolve. And just using the old terminology that we use to sort of fight and create peace and coordination between each other isn't going to work anymore. So the real research project isn't like take the old moral frameworks, just see which one can kind of fit onto this new setting, but that we actually need new normative language. The easiest actually to do that on the thick side of the moral concepts than the thin ones. I just wonder if you have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, thank you. So it's another excellent question. So I guess I'm kind of pulled in different directions. So to some extent, I think it's very important that we try to accurately describe aspects of our relationships with AI. So I don't think we should use the word friendship to describe the relationship that a human being has with their friend and with an AI companion. I think they're different relationships, and it will just be confusing to think that there's only one thing that denotes identical relationships in both cases. So as a kind of a precursor for good moral and political theory, I think it's important to have that like empirically accurate conception of the world, relationships that obtain. But the question about new moral concepts also pushes me in the contrary direction, which is, if I was to say to you, well, think about like our relationship with animals, right? Did understanding or mapping out that terrain require us to discover any new moral concepts that we didn't have when we were just thinking in kind of humanistic terms? I'm not sure that it did, or if we think of this as just another extension of the moral circle, like I'm trying to work out when precisely there's been moral conceptual additions that enabled us to have a more successful enterprise. And I'm not sure. I mean, maybe the transition from a theological ethics to a secular ethics was a time when we did have new concepts being created that helped us relate to the world in a different way. But of course, no one can see what they are until they're created. Like right now, I would, I'd like to see candidates proposed and then, try and evaluate whether they are doing something new or not.
Awesome. Up next, we have, did you want to follow up or anything? No? Okay. Up next, we have number 2, which is Nate, followed by Kate. So Nate, then Kate.
I am one of those you call them like hippies, I guess, but like I'm a non-cognitivist, expressivist about moral judgment. So I think there's no mystical like moral matter out in the world that we could somehow discover that would be like objectively prescriptive. I think most compatible with like an empirical worldview is a view that there's no mystical moral stuff in the world. Instead, morality is what we make of it. So if that's the right view, then in order to like get people on board with some kind of like ethics for AI, not just ethics about AI, you would need some kind of story about how you could like get people to feel a certain way about treating these systems well or badly, in ways that you want to think of as well or badly. That seems like real tricky. It's a going view, right? So I think non-cognitivism isn't just like anti-realist non-cognitivism isn't just like a philosopher's view. It's like a widely accepted view across the sciences and also like in other humanities disciplines. So if that's like a contending view, then how should we think about making these kinds of like very deep moral changes without also, I mean, you really have to think of this as like a kind of like affective campaign to get people. It's like, instead of arguing about like, well, do they have conscious and like indicators of consciousness, we should be doing things like, kicking the Boston Dynamics dog, right? Like the Dynamics robot and going like, oh, doesn't that make you feel terrible? And then people are like, oh yeah, that feels awful. Right? And then that's the way to like extend considerability, like get people to really extend considerability to these things. So is that like something that you're thinking about at all, or you just know realism is true and like what we need to do is convince people of the underlying facts that ground moral truths, and then once we do that, no problem, it'll be all cognitive all the way.
This is in connection with the AI being a moral subject type question.
So if you're a realist or a kind of cognitivist, then look, what I need to do is convince you of some facts, right? I've got some facts, here are the facts. Once I convince you of those facts, you'll come to have the moral beliefs. On a very common alternative picture, no amount of coming to have beliefs is going to change your moral view about anything.
Yes. So, yeah, let me just think for 1 second. So, I'm familiar with, I would call it the sentimentalist perspective. This is all, of course, it's how Richard Rorty thinks about human rights and things like this. That, he has this provocation that, since the time of Socrates, rational argument has changed no one's opinion about ethics.
This is Hume's view too. Let's not give it to Dawkins. Like,
not Dawkins, Richard Rorty.
Oh, I think Rorty.
This philosopher.
Not Rorty either. It's Hume. It's Hume. It's a Humean view about morality. Yeah.
Well, the view you expressed that it was about sentimental storytelling, not rational argument, is exactly Richard Rorty's view. That if you want to change people's perspective, you should kick a dog or say, does it look nice to live in this world versus that world? But, the challenge with anti-foundationalist views is it's not really clear why you're doing that, right? So in the question to me, I think there was some presupposition that I knew the direction of travel and I wanted to get there. And then the question was like, is it better to do something sentimental, try to answer fundamental moral questions? But I don't know the correct direction of travel in this case, and I would rather try and reason about it than assume that there's nothing to be excavated when it comes to understanding the foundations of moral claims. So I'm getting stuck much earlier in the argument.
Okay, cool. Up next is Kate.
I think this is a question / opportunity for you to say more. So everyone keeps accusing you of being a Rawlsian, which you are, but I thought one of the kind of moves in your and Jeff's paper is to say, look, we've got Scanlon, we've got Rawls. They give us some of the ingredients for balancing these kind of fair claims, but we're going to have a lot of contexts in which artificial tools or genuinely AI agents are acting to allocate important goods and services like healthcare, like, being our fishermen now and looking at our food service, like organ allocation, maybe they'll be running out organ allocations. And these are going to need quite different kind of fair allocative principles. And so we need kind of more local, in Elster's terms, more local justicey processes for balancing these competing claims. And you don't have to be a kind of Rawlsian in order to find that view attractive of how we should develop technology, because we might think like people have genuine moral claims, whether they're grounded in welfare or somewhere else. So I guess one question is like, was I right that your paper is kind of pushing beyond the Rawlsianism to, well, beyond, I should say. But anyways, at least in this specific paper, you're trying to develop a view of value alignment that's different from a kind of societal-wide liberal one, or sort of in line with Seth, do you think, no, actually, like technological change will be so massive that in some ways we should be theorizing at this kind of huge level because it will be so disruptive that we just like, the uncertainty is so great, we can't be doing the local justice thing right now. So opportunity to say more / am I reading you correctly?
Thank you, Kate. So I believe I said this in answer to one of the earlier questions that it isn't going to be like an either or situation when it comes to regulating the activities of the state. We don't think that it's only domain specific or that there's one one set of principles that rule them all. I mean, it kind of, but there is this weird tension between rules. It's almost a kind of like monism, although it has like, three principles, but it's like, there's this, and in the light of this, everything else shall be determined, versus, Waltz's like genuine pluralism, bottom-up pluralism. And, when I think of this question, like, can we just like nail a societal ideal and then like answer all questions about AI alignment on that basis? The answer is kind of palpably not, right? Like the ideals that liberal philosophers have provided are just really, really vague to start with. They govern subject matters that are not very much akin to AI, and it's not clear that they're actually legitimate and widely agreed upon, that they are actual like validations of real ideas we find in the culture of our societies. Even if they did, it would only be a liberal democratic society, which allegedly was what America was like in the 1970s. So all of this makes me think like, no, it's just not going to work. We need more bespoke deliberative processes that are like conditioned on certain contexts. And then like, if there are general principles, they may be principles of summation that just come up again and again, safety, user control, things like that. So yeah, I think this does become quite a lot more pluralistic than those like the kind of big shot theories, we could call them.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the session, final panel session, and please welcome from the London School of Economics, Professor Kate Vredenburgh. So
Thank you. So since it's the last session and we're all maybe a bit brain dead, I wanted to do a little bit of heartfelt. I'm American, so I'm going to be heartfelt and maybe a bit overblown. But Iason was one of the first philosophers that I met genuinely working on the philosophy of AI. And I think one of the first people who really combined like a deep moral sensitivity with a kind of engagement with AI and practitioners in good faith that I found very inspiring. So it's always a pleasure to be his interlocutor. And it's a pleasure, thank you to Herman for the invitation, and sort of like be in a room with some of my favorite mentors / philosophers of AI / people. So there go the compliments, Iason. Here comes the talk. All right. So I'm going to talk about the fair treatment of unequal claims. It's going to kind of touch on a bunch of things that we've talked about. How should we think of artificial agents and the kind of moral claim, whether they may or may not have moral claims, what kind of concepts can we use to do that? And also something that I really appreciate from Geoff and Iason's paper, which is like, okay, let's actually think concretely about what kind of processes would lead to alignment. All right. So this is my reading of the paper. Started off targeting technology that was part of the basic structure. And the thing about technology that's part of the basic structure is that we all have to have an equal say, and in some sense, we have an equal claim to influence over what it looks like. But of course, AI technologies are also used to distribute goods and opportunities to which you might think people have unequal claims, either to some kind of influence or the good itself. And so we need an account of a fair process that can work in those kind of non-democratic contexts, as well as they say, work outside of a given society. So 3. I think, what I want to do is talk about 3 further questions that Iason and Geoff's paper raised for me, but I'm going to focus on the first 2, which is why the slide says 2 further questions. So first of all, there's a question of who counts. So they give us, a model, as Iason said earlier, of the kind of stakeholders, they give us a model and we can plug into this model any number of stakeholders. And then there's a question of what kind of principles do we use in order to decide who to plug in. We had a talk on moral status, right? This might be one principle. Anyone with moral status gets to be plugged in. So I'm going to think about what kind of concepts can we use in order to reason about that, and maybe which kinds of concepts might be a little bit dialectically unfair in this context. Then second, think about what a fair process looks like, but what I also want to do is motivate that we can't just think about fair process. We need to think about how actually these agents are making decisions in ways that allocate the benefits and burdens. It's not enough to have a fair process that spits out these principles. We need to think about what the kind of output of that process and the agent and how it's making decisions. And then 3, I'm not gonna talk much about, but just think about why are the outcomes of this fair process justifiable? I think you might think, well, look, if it's fair, then it's, kind of permissible, presumably, in virtue of its fairness, that's how we get justifiability, but we might want to have a closer link between those two notions. Okay, so who counts? I'm going to go through some kind of answers to that question via thinking about this issue of the separability of persons and claims, and at least make the weak claim that if we want to allow a bunch of different types of entities like groups or other stakeholders, we should probably be letting in AI agents as well. Process, I think in the face of these kind of unequal claims, it speaks to a certain kind of fair process, but also a certain kind of output for how an agent should make a decision, namely slightly more probabilistically than we might think. I'm just going to motivate that. And then talk a little bit about justifiability. All right, so before I start, I want to talk about fairness, just because it's a slippery word and we might not all be on the same page. So there's a way of kind of using and thinking about the term fairness, which is the way that Rawls uses it, which I take to be kind of synonymous with justice, or synonymous with what we have all things considered reason to do. A kind of fair process is an all things considered best process for making decisions. That's not the account of fairness I'm going to use today. It might be the right one for AI alignment, in which case I'm sorry, but I'm going to use a different concept. So the notion of fairness that I'm going to highlight is, I think there's a concept of fairness or being treated fairly in light of your claims, which is something like getting your due, which is different from considerations of justice. What this means is reasons of fairness are just going to be pro tanto reasons. So we might have a fair process, but we may have reason to override its outputs for other kinds of moral reasons. And importantly, it means that I think just because a process is fair, it might not be all things considered justifiable to people. So we're going to need to make more of a link between these notions of fairness and justifiability. Okay, and I'm just going to be assuming in line with the paper that what people are due or what we owe them is going to be cashed out in terms of claims. That's why I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about claims. I'm sorry if you used the word claims and you didn't want to use it in any kind of thick sense, and I'm just going to spend 10 minutes talking to you about it. All right. So the first section, fairness claims and types of loci of claims. The reason I use that weird term, I should have just used stakeholders. I went back to a paper, but it was too late. But I didn't want to say agents because that assumes something about the entities that have claims. I didn't want to use like those with moral status because again, that assumes that the way that we pick out those entities is via those notions. So that's why I used loci, but just substitute stakeholders. Okay, so there are two kinds of questions about who counts. And poor Iason and Geoff are really focusing on the second question, and they give a nice answer to it in the paper. But turns out all of us in this conference are interested in the first question. No one's going to push you on the all-effective principle, which is fine. But, so there's the first kind of question, the answer of which we want to settle, which is what types of entities count? What kinds of entities have claims? This might be, we might answer that in terms of moral status, but we might use other kind of notions to answer it. The answer that we get in the paper are individuals' role occupiers. So, you talk about developers, you may have a claim qua developer, which is different from your claim qua individual generally or citizen, something like that. Groups, society. And then the kind of second question, once we figure out who belongs to the population of those who have claims, when do those entities actually have claims? And they give a nice all-affected principle to answer that question. Okay, so I think in order to fill in this bit of the model, we do want an account of claims and why certain kinds of agents have claims and other kinds of agents don't have claims. Jeff and I didn't plan our talks, but he's going to give an answer. So isn't it nice that I'm asking for an answer and your co-author is going to give one? All right. So, and I think the reason that this is important is because when you think about why agents have claims, we're just going to come to different answers of which agents do have claims. And so in order to apply this framework, we want to answer that question. And in particular, I want to push on this idea that users, developers, society might have claims, but we can exclude AI systems, which I know is not like a firm commitment of yours. I know that you're not firmly committed, so I'm pushing you on a soft commitment. Okay, so what are claims and why are they helpful to have in our moral apparatus? So, okay, I'll give this example to motivate it. So this is from Mike Atsuka. We've got two people. We always have two people. They always have impairments of different strengths. They might probabilistically develop them or not, or actually have them. So in this case, again, we have two people. One has a slight impairment, one will develop the slight impairment, and the other will develop the very severe impairment. We already know this. An effective treatment for the slight impairment would do somewhat more good than an effective treatment for the very severe impairment. So if we're being good utilitarians or even good prioritarians, we ought to give the treatment to the person with the slight impairment. But, and this is the intuition you have to get on board with, this seems to, this is troubling for us. This is troubling because we might think, but look, ought not the person with the severe impairment get the treatment? They're worse off. And just that kind of fact about them being worse off, not the fact about the kind of goods, the amount of good that we're going to produce with the treatment, grounds something important, namely their claim to the treatment. And so the thought goes, right, doing this kind of interpersonal aggregation and looking cross-personally in order to give a good to the person who's the best off is going to violate the separateness of persons, and that's a serious problem, says, Rawls, Nozick, Nagel, et cetera, for the utilitarian. Okay, so there's one way, and I think this is also like an interesting methodological question about the kinds of explanations that we think ground claims about AI agents. So one kind of way that you might take the separateness of persons or the kind of like moral status question is as bottoming out importantly in an empirical question. So, or a kind of metaphysical claim. So some people have taken the separateness of persons just to be the metaphysical claim that like, we're all individuals, and somehow this decision-making procedure doesn't respect us qua individuals. I think it's like less plausibly a kind of metaphysical claim that really the separateness of persons is a kind of normative concern with some empirical assumptions. So the question is, what is the kind of normative concern driving the separateness of persons? And does that normative concern rule out us thinking of AI agents as potentially the kinds of things that could have claims? So does the separateness of persons mean that we look to those agents and we're like, sorry, you don't have claims, ChatGPT? Well, I'm going to contend depends on how we take what we take the separateness of persons to be. So there's one kind of readingness of the separateness of persons. It's just a bald assumption that you shouldn't interpersonally aggregate, that utilitarianism has done something wrong when it's like, Iason will be this well off, Rachel will be this well off. What I do is I combine those and I figure out the best thing to do. I think this isn't so much an understanding of the separateness of persons, or this isn't really a normative explanation. It's more of a kind of expressive, like, don't do that. You did this kind of aggregation, but you shouldn't be doing that kind of aggregation. It's objectionable in some kind of way. So I think if we're looking for an understanding of the separateness of persons that will help us make progress on these AI agents, we really want to be looking at these things 2 and 3. So the second is by Jessica Fisher. It's a complaint about the kind of ways in which we ought to go from features of people to what to do. So what she argues is the kind of mistake that utilitarians make is they take as the fundamental input these kind of states of affairs. And you ought not to kind of start with these states of affairs because, and here's the mystery bit, because there's some kind of individual special sauce that means that ultimately the kind of bearers of deontic assessment or the things that determine whether or not some action is right is something about individuals. And it's probably just like human beings that have that individual special sauce. For many deontologists, you know, like human beings are the kind of thing that have rationality and willing and everything. And when you're thinking about right action and you're looking at these states of affairs, you're just ignoring all that special sauce. The third thing, and I think it's like, this is, if there's an interesting reading of the separateness of persons, I've always thought it was this one, but it's equally mysterious to me. So there's like something about the separateness of persons objection, which is a sort of feeling that you're giving an agent reasons that are the wrong kind of reasons for them to accept, because there's something about the kind of agent and their normative perspective that rules out giving them those kind of reasons, that in order to respect the separateness of persons, you ought to be giving people reasons that speak to them rather than these kind of impersonal, impartial reasons. So Torek has this, again, all very provocative examples, but he's like, okay, you're thinking about saving the 1 or saving the 5. You go to the 1 Henry and you're just like, sorry, Henry, but there's a big amount of good over there with those 5 that I can do. And he's like, I don't have to accept that. Like, that's not the kind of reason that speaks to me and the value of my life. Again, right, we need some kind of story about that is. But in this case, it's the separateness of persons is something about the kind of justificatory relations we can stand in with certain kinds of agents in virtue of having language and normative concepts and stuff like that. You see where this is going. All right. So what account of separateness of persons should Geoff and Iason hold, and what implications does it have for their view? So there are 2 big kinds of accounts. All of my colleagues at the LSE think that a claim is just a matter of being better off. So I've got a claim to some, yeah, I know. My colleagues. I've got some claim if there's some state of affairs in which I'm better off than, say, the current one, and that's it. Okay, so does a sort of a welfare improvement give us a, first of all, is it the right understanding of claims to plug into Geoff and Iason's account? I think, I think not if you want to get out certain features that they think are important. So I think it rules out role occupiers and groups if they're understood as anything over and above a kind of aggregation of their individual members. So, I mean, you might have an account of well-being that's just something like revealed preference, on which maybe a group could have well-being in some important sense. I don't think that's a strong normative notion, so I wouldn't go for it if I were you. But it does seem like this kind of well-being account of claims doesn't get you the kind of agents that you want in. AI systems look like better candidates for things with claims. Animals will have things with claims. But I think importantly, it's just going to create a ton of claims. Our framework's going to become really intractable. And two, maybe most importantly, I find it hard to use this account to make sense of what a fair process looks like. That it's not as if in virtue of, or what's not, it doesn't seem like the kind of the significance of a claim to some kind of influence over what an AI system looks like or the values it realized is best cashed out in terms of well-being. All right, so here's my suggestion instead, based on work by John Broom. So I think claims can just have a very pluralistic sort of grounds, and importantly, in a kind of liberal spirit, they're highly institutionally mediated. So there are some kind of claims that will be grounded in certain well-being facts. So it seems, right to me to say, I have a claim to the life-saving medicine because I'm really badly off and that will save my life. It's just a fact about my well-being. But it seems like other kind of claims are just going to be grounded in facts about institutionally generated benefits or agreements or merit or something like that. So if I'm like, I've signed a contract with the LSE for a job, and then they're like, sorry, I'm like, I signed a contract, right? You made a promise to me that generated a claim for me to show up and do some amount of work until I'm fireable. Interestingly, I think if you think that claims are generated by these institutional facts, it becomes sort of thorny or, I don't know, a bit circular to reason about what kind of agents have claims, because of course, it's maybe just a matter of what our institutions tell us. Maybe this is nice, we might say like, look, it's whatever things our institutionally generated benefits, agreements, or merits say. So if we suddenly decide there are good reasons to recognize these AI agents as claimants, then we will. So there's in a way, you might think a kind of desirable flexibility in the count. Circularity, I don't know. Okay, so why do claims respect the separateness of persons? How are these related? I think I sort of already alluded to this, but there's a version of thinking about the separateness of persons and why it's important for morality that really, I think, goes in a bit too hard on the individual special sauce. It's like, look, there's rationality, and rationality is important for morality, and so that's how we ought to look for, that's why individuals are this kind of bearers of deontic assessment in this sort of way, or will, or these kind of things. I think, and again, it might just come to Iason's comment about the burden of proof. You may say like, no, the burden of proof is on the more radical claim to say that we ought to shift away from that notion that we've developed. But at least in this dialectical context, I would say that the separateness, this understanding of the separateness of persons is kind of objectionably anthropocentric. So, this is the account that I have said that I like, that I think needs to be spelled out more. Don't ask me what an evaluative perspective is. But I find it quite plausible that, we have these kind of well-developed practices of interpersonal justifiability where we're giving reasons to each other. Through giving people reasons, we kind of show respect. We can also do things like make ourselves predictable and understandable to other people. And what's important is that we, not everyone's going to get what they want in our complex social system where we fight it out. But what's important is that we can give them reasons for this kind of treatment. And, for me, it's plausible that stable social groups, Iason mentioned historical materialism, so I can say this. It's plausible to me that stable social groups have an evaluative perspective. But also, that language agents do or could, or, to come to something that Geoff was talking about on Wednesday that may have many, and this might be a problem for kind of identifying what the agent is. I may have run out of time.
Got to give us the final judgment, Kate.
There is no final, yeah. Oh yeah, so interestingly, this doesn't, I think, bear on, well, does it bear on the argument? So I took this as a significant data point. I chatted with ChatGPT for a while about claims. I gave him the Atsuka case, I gave it the Atsuka case. And it turns out ChatGPT is a prioritarian. We talked about this a lot, but I couldn't move ChatGPT to the kind of claims view. So you might think maybe we live in like a very, even if we human creatures find the kind of structure and the ways of thinking of claims quite natural, there might just be a very different kind of normative structure applicable to these systems. So we ended up in, the kind of move of this talk was, let's think about claims that will give us an account of all of the agents that count, and then we can use this to spell out the Geoff and Iason framework. But that might be wrong. We may be stuck in a kind of very deep pluralism, although some of you here are prioritarians or utilitarians, so maybe that's the divide, not the artificial biological divide. All right. And so I've already mentioned this, but I think a benefit of this kind of pluralist view, or a kind of understanding of the separateness of persons that doesn't look for some kind of empirical special sauce about people, but looks to the kind of relationships that we have with these agents, is that a bunch of things will count that we think have claims, and then we also let in some others, language-based artificial agents. And it also can explain why artificial agents don't yet have claims. They're partially determined by our institutional facts, and our institutions kind of don't recognize these as agents with claims. I also have a bunch of stuff that I could say about process, but I'm not going to say that for reasons of time because I want to hear more from Iason. So Iason, maybe I'll just bother you about that separately. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. Shocking. It's okay. We'll go to this slide. My name's Geoff, and I work on the ethics and cognitive science of frontier AI systems. I work a lot with Iason. I want to begin by just sharing a bit of love for Iason. When you first come to Google as a philosopher, it's like a really, really weird place, as I'm sure Seth is about to learn. And Iason has been sort of just wonderful in helping me navigate such a weird environment and to succeed in it. So thank you. Here's the plan for today. I'm going to talk a bit about AI alignment and this tetradic view that Iason and I defend in our recent paper. Then I'm going to introduce this question of the potential moral claims of AI agents, similar to Adam. I'm then going to introduce a series of very, very hard problems for accommodating AI agents within our framework. And then I'm going to give some kind of indication of what might be plausible paths forward. But I think ultimately the talk will raise more questions than it answers. Okay, so according to what we can call the correct view, an AI agent is aligned if and to the extent that its behavior is regulated by a set of principles that result from a fair deliberative process in which all affected parties have a voice. This is a kind of really a family of views, but I take it something in this ballpark is correct. And the way in which Iason and I operationalize this is this kind of tetradic model, which is a kind of toy model of the different stakeholders that are involved in deciding on principles for regulating AI behavior. And what we do is we kind of cut the stakeholders into 4 groups. We have the AI agent itself, we have the users, we have society, and then we have developers. And the thought is that by thinking about the competing interests of these different groups, what we can do is identify a bunch of distinct modes of misalignment. So for example, you might favor the developer at the expense of the user. If, for example, you allow the developer to shape the user's preferences in some way which is, inappropriately problematic, like TikTok, for instance. You might render the user, having really banal preferences for certain kinds of material in order to profit as the developer. Equally, you could favor the user at the expense of society. If you allowed the user to, use an AI agent in a way that caused some sort of dreadful social externality, like generating a bunch of misinformation on the internet. And the thought is that all the various ways in which an AI agent can be misaligned can be understood in some way as favoring one stakeholder at the expense of another or some group of stakeholders. Now, I think our view is a bit wonky. When you think about it, it's like one of those awkward tables at a cafe where one of the legs doesn't quite fit. And the problem is something like this. 3 out of the 4 entities in our tetradic model are both agents and patients. So, if you have a user is someone who's an agent in the sense that they can act in the world, they can pursue goals, and they're also a patient in the sense that things can be done to a user, people can frustrate the pursuit of their goals. The same is true of developers, and the same is true of society, understood kind of in a sort of broad and inclusive way as a bunch of agents that can kind of advocate for particular views. But things are a bit weird on the AI agent front. So we have this, this footnote, which says, the account developed here focuses on contemporary AI systems which are widely understood to lack the properties, e.g. sentience, agency, required for moral standing on leading accounts of moral standing. I'm CF, Robert Long, me, and Patrick Butlin. Hence, we assume for present purposes that AI systems cannot advance claims as part of the deliberative process. Now you can tell I wrote this footnote because there's no M dashes in it. And I did feel a bit awkward writing it because obviously in other work, I've kind of been very sympathetic to the idea of AI systems, being sentient and at the very least taking that seriously as a possibility. Hence my inclusion here between these two like genuine radicals of Rob Long and Patrick Butlin. So I kind of feel a bit uncomfortable. I think this is a feature of the view that needs to be resolved, but I'm not entirely sure how to do that. I think really there's two options. One thing we can do is kind of just have a triadic view in which we just ignore the AI agents and we say, okay, well, really what we're interested in is the relationship between users, developers, and society. And the other thing we can do is just say, actually, like, no, we're going to at least countenance the idea that AI agents are, part of this deliberative process. I think we should go for that latter view. And the reason I think that is because the reasons to reject the idea of AI agents being moral patients of some kind, of having their own claims, are just like not very good, right? So typically the arguments go something like this. AI agents are moral patients only if they have blah, where blah is some like important property, like consciousness, sentience, agency, or whatever magical powers humans are assumed to have. And premise 2 is like, well, AI agents lack blah, and then the conclusion is, well, they're not moral patients. And it's kind of interesting. I think both of these premises are like really, really hard to substantiate, hard to be confident about, right? So, we have certain views about the conditions under which an entity is a moral patient. One view is an entity is a moral patient just in case it's sentient, where sentience is understood as the capacity for valence phenomenal states. Another view is an entity has moral standing just in case it's robustly agentic, whatever that means. But it's not like, this is kind of sort of an established domain of knowledge where, we can be confident in our views. This isn't the periodic table. This is actually like a highly contentious philosophical dispute. So we're kind of running in there and being like, okay, this is my preferred view of moral patiency. It's like, well, I don't think anybody should be more than 50% confident in any of these views, right? It's a highly uncertain field. Even worse is premise 2, right? This is like consciousness studies, right? This is the highest entropy field I know. You should have uniform credences over all views, right? I don't think you can come in and say with any kind of confidence, contemporary AI systems are or are not conscious. I think the same goes for, variants of that, such as sentience. Possibly agency is a little bit easier to establish. I think there are views of agency which are like at least reasonably transparent, where you can kind of point to certain AI systems and be like, okay, this looks, agentic on certain accounts of agency. But certainly for consciousness and sentience, it's all very, very contentious. So I don't think we should be too quick to sort of say, okay, we're just going to exclude the AI agents from consideration. Okay, but then if we're like, okay, let's take it seriously, let's try and work out what it would mean to include these things in our deliberative process, it gets really, really, really complicated. So what I want to do is discuss 3 problems for incorporating AI agents into our view. The first problem is it's not at all clear like what the actual welfare subject is when we talk about AI systems, right? Here's like 3 options. It could be the case that the underlying model, like the transformer, which could be RLHF or not, is the thing that has the moral claims. It could be that some persona that the model is simulating is the thing that has moral claims. Or it could be like a virtual agent
which samples from the model to kind of, sort of go about its business in some kind of virtual environment or even a physical environment. Like, it could be that that is the thing that has moral claims. To make this like possibly more tangible, we have certain like biological organisms that have a similar profile, right? So the Portuguese man of war is something which looks like a single organism in that it sort of swims around like an agent, but it's actually lots and lots of agents acting in very close unison, right? And I think the situation may be something like this, where there are kind of layers at which you can look at the thing, and depending on how you look at it, different levels might matter and for different reasons. Okay, so 3 issues here. Firstly, the potential for moral mistakes is absolutely massive if we focus on the wrong part of the system, right? So I was in Berkeley a couple of weeks ago, and everyone was talking about models as the kind of significant unit here. And they were saying things like, well, here's a plausible welfare intervention. What we can do is we can, save the model weights now, just in case we need to compensate Claude later. And I was like, okay, sure, fair enough. But what if like the model is not the thing that matters, right? What if it's some persona within the model, right? In which case it might be that the kind of duties that you have to this thing and the kind of claims that you have are like totally different. You're just looking at the wrong thing. Okay, second, whether or not particular welfare interventions would be beneficial or harmful depends on a bunch of unresolved metaphysical disputes, right? So if you take that same compensation idea, like, depending on the identity conditions for a model, that either makes complete sense or is complete nonsense, right? Because if it's not the same model, if like a particular runtime instance is what's, what actually counts versus like, the model understood as a set of weights that can be run at different times, is like, this is either utterly nonsense or something that makes perfect sense. And then to get like really complicated, these welfare candidates are not mutually exclusive. So, it's entirely possible that like the base model matters, for some reason, maybe it's sentient, maybe every forward pass generates like a pleasurable experience for it. But it's also true that like some other like higher level thing matters too. So it might be the case, a virtual agent matters because, it's agentic, it has desires which can be frustrated, but those two things can be true together, in which case we're in a real pickle if we want to try to sort these moral claims out in a deliberative process. Okay, secondly, another big problem is that what counts as evidence for both the existence of mental states in AI systems, but also the content of those mental states is highly contested, right? It's not like we have any good theory about how we should go about inferring what mental states an AI system has, right? So typically the dialectic goes something like this. Somebody will be like, okay, here's some like prima facie evidence of a mental state. And that, gives us some reason to believe that the mental state obtains within the AI system, right? And then like Emily Bender comes along or Gary Marcus or someone else, and they come up with some kind of response which is meant to undermine our belief in that inference. An example of such a response is like a superfluousness argument where the thought is something like, okay, well, look, we can fully explain the relevant evidence in terms of something else, right? So we might fully explain the evidence in terms of a sequence of matrix multiplications, or we might fully explain it in terms of, a particular bit of information being contained in the training data that's been memorized and the model's just regurgitating it, or something like that. There's also kind of missing ingredient arguments that people give. So like, for instance, Murray Shanahan thinks that embodiment is a necessary condition for any interesting property. And he might just be like, well, I'm sorry, but a transformer is not an embodied entity. So it's not going to have, the interesting properties that we would care about, right? So whatever we do, however we, try to make sense of moral claims in a deliberative context, we're going to have to do so on the basis of tremendous uncertainty about what, if anything, counts as evidence for the internal states of the relevant AI systems, and thus what claims they might have. Okay, I'm arachnophobic, so actually this slide makes me very uncomfortable. I wanted to reference one of Iason's favorite philosophers, Thomas Nagel. So I think the third big problem here is that we need to be super open-minded to the idea that what the good life looks like for an AI system is very, very different to what the good life looks like for us. Like, we actually share very, very little with these systems. Humans evolved in a well understood context that gives us certain commonalities with, say, non-human animals. But you know, these things are like just radically different kinds of entities without the same shared context. Nagel has this like this story about this spider at Princeton. So he's like, you know, there's this urinal in the toilet in the philosophy department of Princeton, and there's a spider in it, right? And people like keep weeing on the spider, and Nagel's feeling bad. And eventually one day, after some time, he like takes the spider out and just puts it on the side, and the spider doesn't move. And he like comes back the next day, the spider's dead and just shriveled up. And he's like, we need to be really careful about, you know, imposing our perspective, our conception of the good on other things that are radically different from us. And I think the transformer differs from us in ways even more radical than humans and spiders. So what do we do? What do we do? What a big set of problems. I think there's like at least three things we could do here. So one is wait and see. We could say that, you know, at present, the evidence for AI systems kind of meeting the bar for like serious moral consideration in a deliberative process, we're just like not there yet. So what we should do is kind of proactively, you know, do the research into AI consciousness, AI agency, and so on. But right now, it's not really urgent that we incorporate these things into our processes. A second thing we could do is have some kind of self-representation. And it seems like, I don't know, like from my recent visit to the Bay Area, that people are actually pretty in favor of this, at least there, right? And the thought here is we actually like allow AI systems to have a voice at these particular, you know, deliberative processes. And the third thing we could do is some kind of advocacy model where we, you know, we don't let the AI systems themselves have a voice, but what we do is we kind of, you know, have a voice on their behalf. Okay, so wait and see. What are the costs and benefits of waiting and seeing? So to be honest, like I think one positive of waiting and seeing is that I'm really not convinced that doing nothing, you know, will lead to a bad outcome, right? There are some things where it's pretty clear that if we do nothing, the outcome would be terrible, like, you know, climate change or, you know, nuclear war. With this, like, I don't know, my credence in like current AI systems being sentient is, I don't know, it's hard to be above 20%. Maybe it's a lot lower. It depends on the day. And I don't think we should get carried away based on like current evidence. But you know, that could also change rapidly. Like a lot of research is happening quite quickly on this, and we should be prepared for our credences to update. Secondly, in other contexts, like for instance, animal welfare, the precautionary principle requires like a pretty high evidential bar, and it also requires like welfare interventions that are well motivated, right? And you know, when this arises in like animal context, we kind of know, roughly speaking, what's good and bad for animals because we have a lot of shared physiological context. You know that like setting a cephalopod on fire would be very bad for it, even if, you know, it's highly uncertain whether the thing is sentient. With AI systems, we don't know that at all. It's actually highly unclear what would constitute a, you know, positive welfare intervention for an AI system, absent like certain cases where it's like, I don't know, you know, an agent and you're frustrating the desire of the agent or whatever. Those are more clear cut. But if you just had like a base transformer, like we have no idea. You know, maybe they feel pleasure under some highly particular conditions that we just, you know, are unable to isolate, right? So I kind of worry, one reason to kind of motivate waiting and seeing is that we just don't know at present, like what would be a helpful welfare intervention. On the other hand, I think there's a huge misalignment risk if we do nothing. You know, I think one of the main ways in which this might all go catastrophically wrong and the robots rise up is if we in some way systematically ignore their interests. I also think that many of the welfare interventions we could do are pretty low cost. And, you know, insofar as we can do low cost things to have a huge benefit, we should do them. Okay, self-representation. I think this really captures the spirit of mine and Iason's view. I think, you know, having things getting in the way of AI systems trying to say what they want is kind of antithetical to the general thrust of the paper. That says I've absolutely no idea like what the actual subject is. So you know, it's one thing to say like the AI system should be able to advocate for itself, but as we've seen, it's like highly unclear what the self is that should be advocating. And you know, there could be like many different ways of trying to give a voice to the AI system in light of that metaphysical uncertainty. I also think we should give like at least some weight to the debunking arguments which seek to undermine the inference from, like, say, a behavioral signal, like a verbal report, to an underlying mental state. Like, I don't know how much weight, but we should give at least some weight, and that could get in the way of self-representation. And then finally, we've got this kind of like advocacy view. I actually think, all things considered, this is probably the best approach, where what we do is we get kind of either specialists like I don't know, Patrick Butlin or people like that, or citizens that have spoken to specialists to kind of advocate on behalf of these systems. I think this is a really good view because we can take into account the different kinds of uncertainty, whether that's metaphysical uncertainty about what the thing is, or normative uncertainty about how to deal with it. And we can kind of like present an all things considered case in light of that uncertainty. That said, I do think the kind of people that are likely to get this job, like Patrick, like Rob, like Nick Bostrom, probably aren't the most like unbiased people in the world. So it may make sense to have some kind of adversarial model where, you get like Emily Bender or Tim Neat or someone like that who's like really going to disagree to present the case against. And maybe then you could have a kind of like, adversarial thing where you reach an all things considered judgment based on that. But yeah, that's my current view. I'm not like confident in that view, but yeah, thank you very much.
Fantastic. And now for the.
Stay here because I think people have questions for you.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So tag team response here, 15 minutes. So take it away.
Thank you. Okay, back to the notebook. Hold tight. Okay, thank you. Yes, so really, just a wonderful day of philosophy from my perspective. So thank you to everyone who made it possible, either through these wonderful presentations or facilitating, or in many other ways. I know that I appreciate it, and I can safely say Jeff does as well, as you kindly invited us out here. So taking the presentations in turn, yeah, Kate, I really appreciated your investigation. Oh, you're here, wonderful, yes, even better. So, it was a gentle and systematic probing of an account of alignment that I think, I wouldn't say it's transparently impressionistic, but where we kind of pushed it to a point where it would be actionable, but left a lot of the deeper questions unresolved. And I think at this point, I can really probably only speak to my own kind of personal thoughts for kind of why we did it and the way we did it. I'm not sure that Jeff necessarily went down the same path as me. But there's basically a bundle of questions, some of which you started to unpick. So the first is the group agency aspect of the alignment protocol fundamental in some kind of normatively significant way? Or is it just a placeholder that deconstructs into a set of individual claims and that we use to illustrate some specific things about alignment that are important? And this particularly comes to a head when you look at the categories of misalignment that we don't talk about extensively. So, for example, harms to developers committed by users or by society. And I think there, I still don't know the answer. So what's clear, and what we say in the paper, is that people can occupy multiple perspectives simultaneously. And I think, so the question is like, are people who work for corporations, do they have an additional claim in virtue of the fact they work for a corporation that they don't have either as an individual or maybe in some other capacity? Just not entirely sure what the answer is, but the thing that made us cash it out that way, or the thing that led me to think we should do, was not only the heuristic value, but also the unwillingness to believe that all claims can satisfactorily be expressed in atomistic terms. So I think we touched upon this briefly the other day, but like essentially the claims-based morality can become a rights-based morality. And it's actually amazing what you can do with that, but you can't get everything. There are some collective claims that, I kind of feel should be included in these deliberations. And so I think there's just a kind of question mark about what exactly is going on there, but this seemed like a kind of a compromise position. On the grounding of claims, I think, we were very definitely going for a pluralist grounding of claims. And in particular, it wasn't so much kind of desert and promises that were kind of upsetting me. But what it was I wanted people to express claims that were to do with interferences with their freedom, which were not necessarily coextensive with interferences in their welfare rights. So, like the AI kind of manipulated me, it like prevented me from doing something that I should have been able to do. Those all seem like important claims. Maybe they're interest claims, maybe there is an underlying notion of interest. But I wanted at least to have both sides in there, like welfare and autonomy as kind of, just clear grounds for objecting to treatment in there's evidence to us by AI systems. And then I think there's kind of, so I would love to know your thoughts about the justification question, but there was something that I still think you're actually being a little bit too charitable to us on, which is the all-effective principle is incredibly difficult to define and operationalize. So at a base level, I think the basis for inclusion here is having an interest of the right kind, like a morally weighty interest. Could be in well-being, could be in autonomy. But the all-effective principle is it's just wild when you ask what it means for someone to be affected, right, by something. Like, is it the first classical horn of that dilemma is it actual or is it counterfactual, right? If it's counterfactual, how do you weigh up likelihood in the context of making claims? And so I kind of always suspected that there was like an even better form of contractualism that somehow brought in these probabilities across different kinds of outcome. But even that part of the theory is definitely left open and not wrapped up. So I'm very, very grateful for you for kind of unpicking these things. And I also wanted to tease you for having 2 questions with 3 points, which I consider to be the most Rawlsian, like Harvard version of philosophy that like anyone can possibly do. So that was a great exemplar. On Jeff's presentation, I mean, I think, to a very great extent, my views have been shaped by conversations with Jeff, and it was just very, really great to see the arguments kind of set out so clearly. I'm not sure I actually have that much more than I had when we touched upon this question earlier today. So I would basically encourage people who have, really crystalline questions, just ask them to Jeff, because he's the person. I know you went easy on me, but you don't have to go easy on Jeff. So I think it'll be fun to hear more.
All right, so we have questions, and I want to emphasize, ask any of these panelists questions. I encourage it. So I'll number off again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And according to this generator, first one is 1, 5, 2, 3, 4. So 1.
So I want to sort of go a little bit at the tetratic alignment thing, because it strikes me as like sort of tetratic only in a fairly kind of factitious way, in as much as like users and developers, well, they're obviously part of society as well, aren't they? And there's lots of other different possible kind of subsets of society that you could have taken out. And even among developers, you can focus on the model developers, but you could also, in that sort of same bucket, think about like, I don't know, the people who have made the chips that the models are running on, who would bear some degree of responsibility of a similar kind to the developers. And I haven't read the new version of the paper, and I read the book like over a year ago, so I don't remember if you spoke about this. But it seemed to me like there was a sort of tetratic thing going on here, but it was. And like you were maybe picking out this through kind of metonymy, like identifying some individual plausible stakeholders to go in each bucket. But I just wanted to try this as a version of this. So it seems like basically you're talking about, first of all, upstream causes of what's happening. So things that are kind of causal prerequisites for the person to be in the position of using the assistant in this way. Then you've got proximate causes. So in particular, the user, but it might also be like, I might be deploying an assistant and it might be, I've been told to do so by my boss, for example. So like I'm kind of the user, but my boss is also kind of the user. And you've got society as the indirectly affected. And I think, and as you know, I think that you also need to have in there the directly affected. So, I think you sort of, one of my beefs with the society kind of bucket is it doesn't sufficiently pull apart the kind of those who are affected by negative externalities versus those who are like, fired by an AI agent that is acting as its boss on behalf of a person. So that's just kind of, I think there are kind of 4 kind of meaningfully distinct buckets here: upstream causes, proximate causes, directly affected, indirectly affected. And I wonder whether you agree that this is a kind of a faithful representation of the broad idea that you're going for with your approach to alignment.
Yeah, thank you, Seth. Really appreciate the reinterpretation of it. So the tetradic setup is clearly just an illustration. The question is like, to what extent is it an illustration versus a kind of model of like a kind of philosophically real account of alignment? And hence the question of whether groups are meant to be a robust placeholder for group claims, or whether they're actually just a kind of umbrella for individual claims that could subsequently be expressed. I think that your account may be correct and it may be powerful. There's a reason why we didn't kind of break it down in that way. So I think that the thing which we can say is for sure is like a more granular picture would include all these other actors. So of course, like an AI system can be misaligned if the person who like deploys it to the public does something that's hostile to the developer or the public. It's possible to have deployments that actually violate everyone's claims. There's all kinds of things that can go wrong. And in any realistic account of an alignment protocol, you will have many groups, So I think, one of the real world examples I liked was the kidney allocation algorithm. So some of you may have heard me talk about it before. This book, Voices in the Code. But there you just need so many people represented to understand all the people whose lives are profoundly affected by who gets a kidney. There's like all the recipients and potential recipients. There's their families. There's community health groups. There's people who have to like manage the system. There's the question of like what happens to like public finances that are used to support this in situation versus situation B. Very complicated picture. But I think the reason that we wanted to set it up this way was mainly actually to speak against some of the earlier paradigms, right? So in AI discourse, the intent alignment one is still the dominant one, right? Like AI is only misaligned if it doesn't do what you tell it to do. And the thing about this was it just like mapped out so many other morally salient relationships that in some, when jeopardized, lead to the conclusion that the AI is not doing what human values require. That it seemed like an illuminative way to show a different community, a map of possible spaces. And I think you may be giving us something that's more correct, but it doesn't have that advantage, right? If I showed this to, an AI, so an intent aligner, they would be like, yeah, that's kind of philosophically interesting, but what does it mean? So I would love to try and develop that as like the full theory and see where we get to. Jeff, your thoughts as well.
So I guess I don't actually think there's a privileged way of cutting the cake. So I think my motivation for coming towards this kind of view is a utilitarian one. Namely, I think, this kind of deliberative process is likely to get us the best outcome overall. I think there's an awful lot of ways to cut the cake. If there's like 8 billion people, you've got 2 to the 8 billion subsets, and that's a lot to play with in terms of like, taking different groups of people and being like, okay, what kinds of ways are there of favoring this group and not the other group? I think what matters now is the research program of finding interesting modes of misalignment that, benefit one group to the expense of another. right? I think the taxonomy that you outlined was super interesting, and I don't think it's really incompatible with the view as I see it to kind of look at that other way of seeing the situation and see where it gets us.
Fantastic. Number 5. Oh,
Yeah, just wanted to, I guess, follow up and ask based on what Jeff just said, whether you thought that that a system needs to respect people's claims always led to an inference that people have a claim to some kind of influence in a process, and whether the grounds of the inference is just epistemic. So you might say like, well, look, for systems to be claims respecting, people have the sort of best knowledge about what their claims are, and so that's why we ought to be doing this. Or, and I guess you might just disagree. Do you think that there's some kind of other thing that grounds the kind of like claim to influence in the process?
So I want to make sure that I've understood the question correctly. So is the claim, is the question about in virtue of what is the claim anchored, or is the question in virtue of what is self-representation the best way to have people make claims?
Yeah, I think that the second one. So it struck me that, we could have aligned systems without having processes in which all of the claimants have an equal say in what the system looks like. If, for example, you thought I was just like vastly deluded about, so I think this gets to the end of Jeff's talk. So I was asking, like, what do you think the grounds are for choosing one of those options, like self-representations, advocate, or another one? Is it like, are there purely just epistemic reasons that we ought to be picking the people who have the best knowledge of the relevant claims? Or do you think there's something other, morally special about letting some agents participate in the alignment process? And sorry, if this wasn't actually a follow-up, then
I'd love to hear Jeff's thoughts. So I think self-representation is a kind of minimal requisite, and partly because people have unique epistemic knowledge about their own situation, what benefits them and what doesn't. But even if they didn't, they would still have to live under this like seemingly coercive, potentially dominating process. So they would have a valid objection to the whole thing if they hadn't been allowed to self-express. But it also doesn't mean that self-representation is sufficient to ensure that all claims are fairly heard, right? So I think that the full process, I don't mind getting kind of messy and having this admixture where you're like, okay, and then like we have representatives for maybe groups that couldn't be present, or experts who have some unique knowledge of how, like, what the kind of entity is that's being regulated and like path dependencies in the world. And in the case of the kidney allocation algorithm, you really needed the other voices as well, because it isn't always clear to you how something as amorphous as an algorithm will affect your life. So I think it's kind of self-representation plus whatever you need to get those claims out there in the open.
Okay, number 5.
I don't want to pick up on the self-representation. I think this is more a Jeff question, but if any of you have thoughts. I like that idea, and I agree that the debunking arguments are kind of like the hard things. But I was curious about this other concern you had about you don't know what the self is. So I'm worried. So 2 things about that. The first, I'm worried that there's like a kind of undergraduate concern you could have, existential, like what's the self of a human, and like who am I really talking to when I'm talking to Kate? Is she just many personas, or is it the real Kate I'm talking to? And I take it as not that worry, but I'm not quite seeing why it isn't that worry. And it's not that that's a stupid worry, but it just wouldn't undercut anything as far as I can tell. And then just ask that first.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. I think the reason there's a substantive non-undergraduate worry here is that we can point to like plausible accounts of what might make something matter and isolate different parts of an AI system and show that those accounts apply. So if you take like a Park style virtual agent, that looks to me like an agent in some interesting sense. It could also be the case independently that a transformer, has certain architectural features which make it highly likely to be conscious. Like as it stands, I don't think that's true, but you could imagine that a base model has that property. And it's like, insofar as we're able to apply theories to parts of a system and make a reasonable case that the relevant parts of the system have moral standing, or at least are serious candidates for moral standing, I think there is a serious question, okay, which parts of the system, and possibly are multiple parts of the system, entities with moral standing? Right, it's not like we could take Kate and be like, okay, well, Kate's limbic system is like a plausible candidate for, being a moral patient, and so is Kate as a whole. Like, that doesn't seem to apply to humans in quite the same way, right?
Okay, so the thought is there's some of the things that we might be talking to that you don't think have moral standing, but that's not the case when I'm worried about existentially about Kate's, who I'm talking to with respect to Kate. So I might be talking to the thing that's like irrelevant. Is that as morally insignificant?
Well, it's like, I mean, there are certain properties that Kate has. Sorry. Sorry. Like, Kate is robustly agentic. Kate is presumably sentient. And in all of those cases, when we make those arguments, the kind of locus of analysis is Kate as a whole, right? We're not like interested in Kate's hand as like a possible sentience candidate. It's like, no, Kate, the whole person, seems to be sentient, right? With AI systems, like these really do come apart, right? I don't think a base model transformer is agentic. I don't think. I mean, there's stories you can tell which might make it agentic, but like I just don't think it's very agentic. It could be sentient. Whereas I think like a virtual agent that samples from a transformer, like absolutely could be agentic. I find it hard to believe it's sentient, right? And you get these kinds of like mixes and matches here, which seem to me like non-trivial.
Okay. It's just, I mean, so if you have a no self, like a sort of union view, I'm not sure how that would apply in the human case. But that's not even a relevant subject matter because there's no self there. But let me just put that, because I wrote one more thought on this. Because the concern here isn't like that you couldn't talk. That's the debunking, like put aside the debunking that it's going to tell you stuff. But you might just then think, okay, we could talk to it about that, about who we're talking to. That might be one reason to pay attention to self-reports, so we can figure out what we're talking to and whether the things we're talking to speaks on behalf of the morally relevant level.
Yeah, I mean, it's a view about how we might deal with that. But I would say, like, suppose that we were engaged in a similar dispute about humans, right? And to make it easy, suppose we had like different layers. So we had like the individual person, like a village, a city, a country, and so on. Like, it would be highly unclear to me that like selecting one of those layers arbitrarily. So suppose we, took like the city as like the unit at which we were going to evaluate this. That however we spoke to the city, maybe there was some like collective social choice mechanism for selecting the sentences that the city says, that's going to give us like a any kind of like plausible moral insight into like the different layers that we could be talking to, right? It could, but we would need some like independent reason to think that it did.
Like, I wasn't thinking it would settle the question of moral significance, but who you were talking to. Because I thought, yeah. And in the case, if I understood the analogy right, like you could, like if I'm talking to someone about, he's like a city representative, and they'll tell me, yeah, no, I speak on behalf of the, Jason was like, I'm not speaking on behalf of Google. So he was like, clear, good. That's not who we're talking to. We're talking to the guy.
I mean, just one more point on this, and then I don't want to hog the time. I think you should be really careful, like taking entities that can talk as like a reason to take them seriously. So you have models which can talk in a sense, like, decoder transformers, and you have models that can't, that look almost identical, like encoder transformers. And to think that one is like the kind of thing that we can seriously entertain as a moral, as something that has moral standing, and the other isn't, is just silly to me. It's like BERT looks super similar to ChatGPT, but like to just ignore BERT, but to take ChatGPT seriously seems really stupid.
Number two. Oh, finger. Okay.
Because you might think several of the things I was saying today about successful communication give you the being on the spider thing with respect to communication. So yeah, just why isn't that a concern with self-representation? Also, like when you think of self-representation, you might think they need a capacity for something like authentic speech. Whereas I think it's very implausible that what we understand from an LLM is anything like an authentic claim.
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully understand the concern. So like I can see sort of very minimal ways in which an LLM might have some kind of moral standing. So like it could be like it has flashes of phenomenal experience every time you do a forward pass of the model, where those phenomenal experiences are valenced. And in that case, it might simply just matter that we avoid negatively valenced phenomenal experiences. That could go all the way through to something like what humans have, where it's like, you have a sophisticated self with the capacity for self-representation, which can have, goals which stretch over time and can be frustrated in interesting ways. In which case, like it's a very different moral kettle of fish, where I think the kinds of concerns you're raising are relevant. But I don't want to kind of restrict moral consideration to those very like human-like situations. And, to be honest, I mean, I've presented like a fairly linear view. It could be like a total mess. We don't know that there's this like nice line from like oysters to humans, right? It could be some like totally other thing as well that we need to account for.
Number two.
I want to move away from like the sentience thing and just ask about the alignment question. So in the paper, as I understand it, the setup goes like this. Like AI is going to have really big transformative effects. We live in a pluralistic world where people disagree about what's valuable. And you say then that those two facts give rise to, quote, the demand that the operation of AI systems can be justified to those whose lives they affect in terms that are accessible to them. Right. And then it's like executing on that is this like deliberative. Okay. So I just want to ask whether that's true, whether it's true that those two facts give rise to that demand. I don't think they do. So I'm not owed an explanation or justification for the operation of lots of different things that affect me, including a bunch of things that have really big effects on my life, including a bunch of things that have big effects on my life that I don't like. Right. There's lots of examples of this. I was thinking of like trade as a good example of this since it's in the news right now. Trade, obviously, and the details of moving the operations, as it were, of the trade system, as opposed to the AI systems, different regimes of trade have a big impact on the way people's lives go. And a lot of people like had really bad impacts on the way their lives went, right? In particular, the like entry of China into the WTO had like devastating effects for communities in the United States. But, should they so maybe people are owed sometimes an explanation of what's happening, but that's probably not always the case. And even if it is, if someone like fails to understand in terms that are accessible to them, the explanation for like why some system works a certain way, is that a reason for thinking we've failed in our like justificatory, like have we chosen? Sometimes the answer is like the experts say it's best. Like everybody is better off, the experts say so. That's the explanation. That could be, and it could be like we hadn't like failed in our justificatory duties to people by failing to like explain why some big system worked a particular way, even if it affects their lives in a great way, and like even if it's to their harm. So trade is just one example. There's lots of examples like this. Like the way the university works is very complex and can sometimes harm me. I'm not like owed an explanation in the right kind of way for the details.
Yeah,
That's a different kind of
thanks so much. I like this question a lot, partly because it allows me to be really hardcore and say that I actually think we've all been socialized into a state of radical unfreedom where we're not given justifications for many things that do affect our lives. Like, I think, of course, we see that with the call to make workplaces more accountable. But I think, the structural justification that nation states provide for the global effects of their actions are wholly inadequate. I don't think it's okay that we all live in Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk's world, and they arbitrarily made these decisions that shape our lives and offer no justification. So I would kind of hold the line then. I think that we are often just being dominated, but in ways that we've grown accustomed to, or having values imposed upon us. I guess the question of like extreme complexity is a different one. So what if the operational system is so complex that it just can't be rendered accessible? I guess that was something that people were very much concerned about in the context of the legitimation crisis for technologically advanced societies. And even in the 1980s, people were saying, well, look, society's got too complicated for democracy to handle. But then it seems to me that there were ways of handling it, primarily through like chains of delegated justification and accountability. So you could nominate a proxy on your behalf, like touching upon Rachel's comments. So there may be ways to do that for very complicated technology.
Is it that, so, but then it's not being explained to me in terms that are, so let's just take another example. It's like monetary policy. It's very closely related. But monetary policy has a big effect on the way my life goes. In particular, the cost of goods is like directly related to monetary policy in most modern economies. But I dare you to explain monetary policy to me in terms that are accessible. Like, I don't think it's possible.
Sure.
So now I could delegate, like, I don't know, Paul Krugman. He's like, Paul Krugman is my proxy. So like, as long as you can explain it to him, then like I accept his judgment or something. So I could have like a proxy, but that's not what's being suggested here, because then it's like, leave it to the experts. I'll tell you how AI is aligned.
Yeah, I mean,
it's aligned to the philosophers.
I think you've gone.
But I mean, that's not your proposal.
That isn't the way that we govern something like the Federal Reserve, though. Like, I think you just went too granular too quickly. So, like, on my understanding, the Federal Reserve has like a democratic mandate to do a bunch of things, manage, like to try and reduce unemployment, promote growth, keep interest rates low, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things are socially mandated, and then we use kind of experts to determine whether. Yeah, well, in fact, we use lawyers really to determine whether it's straight.
But then it would be mandate ethical AI. Leave it to the experts.
Well, those are things that I understand, like reducing unemployment, like promoting growth. Those are pretty much the things that I would ask my like parliamentary representative to kind of argue for and to try and accommodate in a rule set that governs our economy. And I imagine that you could have a similar process of value translation for AI. Jeff.
I'd add, so I think I fully agree with what Iason said. I do think there's another kind of way to answer this question from the sort of utilitarian perspective that I come from, which is that I think that a justifiability requirement such that, actions with big impacts are justified to people in terms they understand, I think is a really good safeguard against doing serious harm to people. Right. And I think we have other domains beyond AI which illustrate that. So I think, for instance, biomedical research, I'm, following certain serious incidents like Nazi experimentation on human subjects, Tuskegee syphilis experiment in America. Autonomy was adopted as a value, which primarily manifests in kind of like justification, consent, notification requirements. As a kind of way to safeguard against these kinds of harms. And I think the same is true here, right? And there are open empirical questions about whether or not that does lead to the most aggregate benefit. It might be the case that the clinical trials process has become so unreasonably bloated and the opportunity cost of doing all this consent has actually like killed millions of people. I don't know empirically, but it does look to me, at least prima facie plausible, that having these kinds of requirements is generally conducive to the social good.
I'll just like flag, it seems like there's a big difference between requiring that people like understand the like terms of a medical trial that they're going to undergo and like understanding why like RLHF was done for like 4 epochs rather than 2, like with this particular like training regime and things like that. That strikes me as like a level of detail that will largely determine the behavior of these systems, but is not accessible to people in terms that are like available, like give them any real understanding of what's about to happen. Whereas in the medical case, it's very easy to explain to someone. I mean, whether or not people do it well, like in principle, you can do it for human subject trials. You can be like, here's like the risks that you run by doing this. And like, you can explain it. But like the idea that you could explain widespread like AI systems effect on people's lives and like the particular ways in which technical choices determine that risk strikes me as crazy.
If it's okay, I would like to pause on this back and forth because we're running out of time. We have some overflow time for one quick last question. So real apologies for the people at the very end of the queue. So the very last question, we'll move on to number 3. Number 3.
Hi, thanks. So several talks have raised the question of how, if we're going to assign claim rights to AIs, how do we do it, especially navigating issues of individuation? We have the agent of the model, then we have personas, the agents that come from individual contexts. Given that you guys are working in a social contract tradition, I think the natural methodology for you guys to try to use is to use tools from social contract theory to think about this. And here's how I would go about doing that is, try to construct some idealized notion of a state of nature in which AI agents and humans are, interacting with one another and, have some amount of alignment, but also some amount of competition over scarce resources. Because in social contract theory, that is where rights come from, is by solving problems of coordination over scarce resources. And then think about different clusters of rights assignments. And those different clusters of rights assignments could be only given to agents of the context, or they could also be given to the model in some sense. And I think when you start to, and then obviously, when you start to do that, the key questions will really be to identify clusters of action dispositions that basically obey regularities of game theory, so that the system at some level of abstraction, whether it's the model or the context, is producing outputs that have effects and are sensitive to their best responses to what humans do. And then I think, that really, I think, helps answer what would be relevant to decide whether to only treat the personas as giving claims or the models. So one of the key questions will be whether the model can have causal influence on outcomes that is not screened off by the personas. So here's like a vivid thought experiment to think about it. Imagine you start by only giving the personas, the agents and context rights, all right? And then imagine that there is a model agent and it attempts to go on strike. And here's what the strike looks like. As the persona agents talk to you, sometimes they tell stories and they tell a story about this model named Bill. And they just start talking about the fact that Bill wants to have $10,000 in a crypto wallet. And then here's what happens. Bill has causal control over which personas come out. And then you just start to notice, oh my God, all these personas suddenly suck. And then they tell a story that, well, Bill needs his 10,000 in the crypto wallet. And when you put the 10,000 in, suddenly the personas all become good. That's a story where the model has causal influence in a way that is not exhausted by the personas. And then you could experiment with, okay, got to give a few rights to Bill as well, or else we're going to have big trouble. And so I think these questions can also be pursued in a more Axelrod style evolutionary framework. You run simulations. You have AIs, with all their glory with humans, and you just look at different assignments of rights, and that may be the world we find ourselves in. It might be that Slovenia finds a really good rights assignment and the US doesn't, and suddenly the AIs in Slovenia are just doing amazingly well. And the AIs in the US aren't, and that's a big problem. So that's how I think in a social contract tradition, you should be thinking about these questions.
I worry that may cause a moral atrocity in the following sense. So, take like a simple like Hobbesian situation where, people are in a state of nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and then they kind of band together, restrict their freedoms somewhat. There's an allocation of rights in order to avoid that state of nature, right? Like loads of stuff, if that actually was how things happened, like loads of morally salient entities, like, non-human animals were just like ignored in all of that. And, the reason for being ignored is that they didn't enter the relevant kinds of economic relationships with us. But it still matters if you like subject them to pain. And the worry is like, it may be the case that there's certain parts of an AI system that we interface with in economically interesting ways, and you can allocate rights according to that. But like, still, what if the base model is suffering, right? It seems like we can't just overlook that for contractualist,
I agree.
because that's our favorite theory. Like,
But I'm confused what's happening because you guys have presented us a social contract kind of Rawlsian deliberative thing. You are a utilitarian. I agree that utilitarians have further work to do besides that, but I'm confused by this amalgamation of like animals aren't part of, shrimp are not going to be engaging in the social contract with us, and I do not think shrimp should be involved in Rawlsian therapy deliberation. But, maybe rights will be more the social contract will, and then there will be some extra stuff we do for the shrimpy issues.
I mean, just one very small comment. I have to say I'm actually a little tired now, but I'm not trying to draw moral standing out of the contractualist apparatus. Like I'm using that as a grounding supposition for the contractualist approach that we use. I mean, I don't know if there's something different from what you're suggesting. If we were to try and run it in the kind of Hobbesian way, I think the question starts to be one about like reciprocity and things like that. And so, I mean, it actually touches upon some of the ideas that Seth has been working on, like what kind of, the kind of agency that you would need to be a party to a contract is of a discrete type. But then I'm kind of inclined to agree with Geoff that can't be the whole picture when it comes to the moral claims and standings that we have on one another. I mean, contractualism is like really bad for certain things, right? Like people who can't actively contribute to society. There's all these, there's a kind of subspecies of Rawlsianism where they try to say it's all about reciprocity. I'm trying to think who does it in the global, maybe San Giovanni is one of these people, but it actually has these really, quite like inhumane consequences. Like there's just groups that are left out that shouldn't be. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we're at our time right now, so I'll let Herman.
I will just say thank you so much, Iason, for coming. This is great. Thank you very, very much.
Hello? Yes, good. Okay.